Greetings everyone. This is Bald Voldemort. Prepare yourselves for what if Harry Potter raised and trained by X-Men after he awakens his X gene. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The cupboard and the storm. The cupboard under the stairs smelled like dust and spiders, and the particular staleness of a space that had never once in 10 years been meant for a child to sleep in. Harry Potter knew every inch of it by feel alone. The exact place where the third stair creaked above his head, the rusted nail that caught his shoulder if he sat up too fast, the thin blanket that had been washed so many times it had stopped being any color at all. He knew it the way you know the inside of your own mouth. He had grown up in the dark, and the dark had never once tried to hurt him. That was more than he could say for the people upstairs. It was the second week of July, and Privet Drive baked under a heat that made the tarmac shimmer and the neighbors' sprinklers hiss uselessly against browning lawns. Number 4 looked exactly like every other house on the street, trimmed hedges, a car in the driveway that Vernon Dursley washed every Sunday like a religious rite, curtains so clean they practically squeaked. Nobody looking at that house would have guessed that inside it, a boy was currently being screamed at for a crime he hadn't committed. "I don't care whose fault it was," Vernon bellowed, his face gone the color of a ripe tomato, a vein pulsing above his collar. "That casserole dish was your Aunt Marge's, and it is ruined, and you were the last one in that kitchen. I told you." Dudley knocked it off the counter, reaching for the biscuits. Harry started, and that was his mistake, because Vernon Dursley did not like being contradicted in his own home, particularly not by the freak who lived in his cupboard out of what he considered an act of extraordinary charity. "Are you calling my son a liar?" Vernon's hand came up fast, faster than a man his size should have been able to move, and caught Harry across the side of the face hard enough to knock him into the banister. Pain bloomed white and sharp along his cheekbone. He didn't cry out. He'd learned a long time ago that crying out only made it worse, made Vernon feel like he was accomplishing something. "Vernon," Petunia said from the kitchen doorway, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite disapproval, more like caution, the tone of someone worried about property damage rather than a child's face. "Not in the hallway. The Fitzgeralds can see through the front window. Get him in the cupboard," Vernon snapped, and shoved Harry hard enough that he stumbled the last 2 steps into the small door under the stairs on his own, saving Vernon the trouble of dragging him. The door slammed. The lock, a small brass hookandi that Vernon had installed himself 2 summers ago, right after Harry's magic had blown up Aunt Marge like a furious purple balloon at a dinner party none of them ever spoke of again, clicked shut. Harry sat in the dark with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up to his chest, and he pressed his palm flat against his cheek, feeling the heat rising there, the promise of a bruise that would be purple by morning and yellow-green by the time it faded enough for anyone at school to stop staring. Not that anyone at school looked at him much these days. Summer meant no school, which meant no teachers, no Mrs. Fig down the street, no witnesses of any kind. Summer for Harry Potter was the worst season of the year, and it always had been. He didn't cry. He'd stopped crying around the time he was 7. Not because it stopped hurting, but because he'd realized crying didn't do anything except make the walls of the cupboard feel closer. Instead, he sat very still and did what he always did. He counted his breaths and thought about small things. The way Dudley's friend Piers Polkiss had once tripped over his own feet chasing him and gone face first into a hedge. The way the library at school smelled like old paper and had a radiator that clanked in winter. Small good things, held carefully, like coins in a pocket with a hole in it. He didn't know yet that something inside him had been quietly changing for weeks. He didn't know that the strange headaches he'd been having, sharp little flashes behind his eyes, like migraines except they came with a taste of ozone in the back of his throat, were not headaches at all, but the sound of a lock turning somewhere deep in his blood. A second door opening behind the first one. His mother's death had already unlocked 11 years ago. He didn't know that in a mansion outside a small town called Salem Center in upstate New York, a bald man in a wheelchair sat in a darkened room lined with humming machinery and had been feeling, for the better part of a month, a strange pressure building at the very edge of his mind, like the moment before a lightning strike, too far away to read clearly but too strong to ignore. Harry knew none of that. All Harry knew was that his cheek hurt, that dinner had apparently been canceled for him tonight. No cans of soup slid under the door this time, which meant Vernon was really and truly furious, and that outside the cupboard door, through the thin wood, he could hear the television murmuring, the clink of Petunia setting the table for 3, and Dudley's high, satisfied laugh at something on the screen. He closed his eyes and waited for the night to pass, the way he always did, and told himself, the way he always did, that eventually he would be old enough to leave, and none of this would matter anymore. The storm that broke over Privet Drive just past midnight was not natural, though nobody on the street would ever know that. It came up fast, no warning, no gradual build of clouds. One moment the sky was a flat orange-black from the streetlights, and the next it had gone the color of a fresh bruise, clouds boiling in on themselves, and the first fork of lightning split the sky directly above Number 4 with a crack that rattled every window on the street. In her bed stormed Storm, though she was 3,000 miles away in her own bed in Westchester. Her body still, her mind wide awake, had nothing to do with this one. This one was Harry's, though he wouldn't understand that until much later. This one came from inside him, some instinct too old and too deep to have a name yet, responding to a threat his conscious mind hadn't even registered. Because in the kitchen of Number 4, Vernon Dursley had had 4 beers after his casserole dish incident cooled from fury into a low, simmering resentment, and 4 beers on a hot night made him meaner than usual, and somewhere around 1 in the morning, he decided that the freak needed reminding of exactly whose house this was, and exactly how expendable he'd become. He didn't bother being quiet about unlocking the cupboard. Harry woke instantly. He always woke instantly, a habit born of 10 years of needing to the sight of his uncle's silhouette filling the doorway, backlit by the hall light, swaying slightly, a leather belt wrapped twice around his fist. "Little freak thinks he can lie to my face," Vernon muttered more to himself than to Harry, the words slurred at the edges. "Thinks he can ruin things that don't belong to him and just sit there. In my house." "Uncle Vernon," Harry started, scrambling back against the wall, and something in his voice must have carried more fear than usual, because for the first time in a long while, real fear, not the dull, practiced wariness he usually felt, but something sharper, colder, an animal certainty that this time was different, flooded through him. The belt came down. Harry threw his arm up on instinct, and the leather cracked across his forearm hard enough to leave a welt that would blister by morning, and Vernon raised it again, his breathing ragged, and that was when it happened. Harry didn't decide anything. There was no moment of choice, no gathering of will the way there'd been with Aunt Marge, no flash of specific anger he could point to afterward and say that was what did it. It was more like a dam breaking that he hadn't even known was there. One second he was a 10-year-old boy cowering in a cupboard with his arm raised to block a blow, and the next second every hair on his body stood on end. The air around him went thick and electric, and the single bare bulb in the hallway overhead exploded in a shower of glass and sparks. Vernon staggered back with a shout, more startled than hurt, and Harry felt something open. It wasn't like his old magic. His old magic had always been reactive, sudden, gone as quickly as it came, a shattered window, an inflated ant, a snake set loose at the zoo, small violent miracles that happened to him rather than through him. This was different. This had weight and direction. He felt it move down through his arms like something waking up after a very long sleep, stretching, testing the edges of a body it had never fully occupied before. And the air around his hands began to hum, not sparkle, not shimmer, hum. A low vibration he could feel in his teeth. And when Vernon lunged forward again, belt raised, bellowing something about ungrateful little freaks, Harry didn't flinch back this time. He put his hand up not to block, but simply because some new instinct told him to, and the belt met something that was not skin. Vernon screamed, a short, ugly, shocked sound, and yanked his hand back, the leather smoking faintly where it had touched whatever now surrounded the boy in the cupboard, a faint corona of static that crackled blue-white in the dark. What are you?" Vernon's voice cracked with something that had gone past anger into real terror, and behind him in the hallway, Petunia's bedroom door opened, and she stood there in her dressing gown with her hand pressed to her mouth, staring at the boy who was no longer cowering in the cupboard but standing, small and thin, and 11 years old in 3 days' time, with electricity crawling visibly across his skin like something alive. "Don't," Harry said, and his own voice surprised him, steady, low, nothing like the frightened whisper he usually used in this house. "Don't touch me again." He didn't raise his hands. He didn't need to. The lights along the hallway ceiling flickered and burst one after another in a stuttering wave moving away from him, glass raining down onto the carpet. And outside, the storm that had built without warning cracked apart directly overhead with a peal of thunder so loud it shook dust from the rafters, and every dog on Privet Drive started howling at once. Vernon fell back against the opposite wall, breathing like he'd run a mile, staring at the boy in the cupboard doorway with the particular horror of a man realizing, all at once, that the thing he had spent a decade treating like an inconvenient stray was not, in fact, something he had ever had any real control over. Dudley's door banged open down the hall, and Dudley himself appeared in his pajamas, blinking blearily, and took one look at the scene. His father flattened against the wall, his mother frozen in the doorway, and Harry standing in the wreckage of the hall light with blue static crawling up his arms and lightning flashing behind the curtains, and let out a wail like a kicked dog and slammed the door shut again. Harry stood there for a long moment, feeling his own heartbeat in his ears, feeling the strange new hum settle slowly back down under his skin like water receding after a flood. The static faded. The room went dark and ordinary again, except for the broken glass and the smell of ozone, and the ringing silence where screaming had been a moment before. "Go to bed," Harry said quietly, and he wasn't sure where the authority in his voice came from, but Vernon went, edging along the wall like a man escaping a wild animal, and Petunia followed him, and the door to the master bedroom shut with a soft, frightened click, and Harry Potter was alone in the wrecked hallway of Number 4 Privet Drive at 1 in the morning, his arm throbbing where the belt had struck it, his skin still tingling faintly with something he did not have a word for yet. And for the first time in his entire life, he understood with absolute clarity that his uncle was afraid of him. He didn't sleep. He sat on the stairs above the ruined cupboard, wrapped in the thin blanket, and watched the storm outside slowly burn itself out over the rooftops of Little Winging. And somewhere in that quiet, exhausted hour before dawn, 3,000 miles away, Charles Xavier sat bolt upright in his study with his hand pressed flat against his temple, gasping like a man who just surfaced from deep water. The mansion at Salem Center did not look, from the outside, like the epicenter of anything extraordinary. It sat behind its iron gates in the pale gray light before sunrise, wisteria climbing one wing, tennis courts gone quiet, the whole grounds wrapped in the particular hush of a school on summer holiday. But 2 floors below the mansion's polished halls, in a chamber lined with concentric rings of humming steel, Charles Xavier sat inside Cerebro with the helmet's weight settling over his temples, and felt the world's 7 billion minds spread out below him like a vast, glittering ocean, and one single point on that ocean burning so bright it made the machinery around him strain audibly, coils overheating, the whole chamber filling with the acrid smell of hot metal. "Sweet Christmas," said the voice at the door, and Aurora Munro Storm, though right now she was simply a woman in a dressing gown who'd been woken by the alarm klaxon 2 minutes earlier, stepped into the chamber's outer ring, her white hair catching the blue light of the monitors. "Charles, what is that? I've never seen a reading like that." Xavier pulled the helmet free, and his face, always composed, was drawn tight with something that looked almost like fear. "England," he said. "Surrey." "A child, Aurora. I've read thousands of mutant signatures in this chair. I've never felt anything like this. It's not just strong, it's layered. There's something underneath it, something old, wrapped around the mutant signature like." He stopped, searching for words that didn't quite exist yet. "Like 2 rivers running in the same bed. I don't know what I'm looking at." Logan appeared in the doorway a moment later, shirtless, hair a mess, a half-lit cigar clamped between his teeth that he hadn't bothered lighting because the alarm had cut him off mid-motion. "Somebody want to tell me why the whole East Wing smells like a busted transformer?" "A child in England just manifested with enough force to overload Cerebro's dampening array," Xavier said. "I need eyes on the ground. Tonight." Logan's eyebrows went up. "Tonight. Charles, it's 5 in the morning." "It was worse for him," Xavier said quietly, and something in the flatness of his voice made both Logan and Aurora go still. "I caught fragments. Pain, sustained pain, not from the manifestation, from before it. Fear. A room too small to stand up in. Aurora, I need you for the flight. There's already a storm system over that part of England, and if what I'm reading is accurate, it may not be entirely natural." "Logan, I'm in," Logan said, before Xavier could finish the sentence, already turning for the door. "Kids alone in a room too small to stand up in and scared out of his mind. You don't gotta ask me twice." The Blackbird left the underground hangar 40 minutes later, cutting east across the Atlantic under cover of a moonless pre-dawn sky, and Charles Xavier sat in the cockpit's rear cabin with his eyes closed, one hand resting on the arm of his chair, trying gently, so gently, the way you'd approach a wounded animal, to find that burning point in the ocean of minds again, and to send, just once, the smallest possible ripple of reassurance across 3,000 miles of dark water. Someone is coming. "You are not alone. Hold on." He didn't know if it landed. He hoped it did. Harry didn't sleep, but he must have dozed at some point on the stairs, because he woke with a crick in his neck and pale gray light coming through the frosted glass of the front door, and for one disoriented second he thought the whole night had been a fever dream. The belt, the static, his uncle's face gone slack with terror. Then he looked down at his forearm and saw the welt, dark red and already bruising at the edges, and he knew it had all been real. The house was silent in a way it had never been silent before. No radio in the kitchen, no television murmur, no sound of Dudley's video games. Harry crept down the last few stairs, careful of the broken glass still scattered across the hall carpet, and found the kitchen empty, the curtains drawn even though it was well past dawn. A note sat on the table in Petunia's cramped handwriting, gone to Marge's for a few days. Food in the fridge. Don't touch anything you shouldn't. No mention of what had happened. No mention of when they'd be back. Just a family fleeing their own house rather than spend another night under the same roof as the boy in the cupboard. Harry read the note twice and felt something strange settle in his chest, not quite triumph, not quite loneliness, something in between, a kind of hollow, aching freedom. He was, for the first time in his life, entirely alone in the house, and nobody was watching, and nobody was going to hit him, and he had absolutely no idea what to do with that fact. He made himself toast. He sat at the kitchen table, the actual table, not the counter where he usually ate standing up, and ate it slowly, watching dust motes turn in the thin morning light, and tried very hard not to think about the blue static that had crawled across his skin like something alive, or the way the light bulbs had burst one after another down the hallway, or the way his own voice had come out of his mouth sounding like someone else entirely. He had always known he was strange. He had spent 10 years being told in a dozen small and large ways that his strangeness was a curse, a shame, a thing to be locked up and hidden and never, ever discussed. Last night had felt like something different. Last night had felt like a door. The doorbell rang at 8:30 in the morning, and Harry nearly choked on his toast. He crept to the front window and peered around the edge of the curtain, half expecting Vernon back to finish what he'd started, sober and armed with a better plan this time. What he saw instead was a woman standing on the front step with skin the color of dark honey and hair as white as fresh snow, falling in a sheet to her waist, wearing a long coat that seemed entirely wrong for the July heat, and standing slightly behind her, a shorter, stockier man with sideburns and an expression like he'd rather be literally anywhere else, sniffing the air like a dog that had caught an unpleasant scent. They did not look like anyone who belonged on Privet Drive. They did not look like anyone who belonged anywhere Harry had ever seen, and there was something about the way they stood, utterly relaxed, utterly unhurried, the woman's eyes tracking the sky like she was reading a book only she could see, that made every instinct Harry had ever developed for reading danger sit up and take notice. He did not open the door. The woman knocked again, more gently this time, and then spoke, her voice pitched to carry through the wood without being loud. "Harry, my name is Oraro. We're not here to hurt you. We felt what happened last night. We know something happened. And we know it wasn't the first strange thing that's ever happened to you. We'd like to talk, if you'll let us." Harry stood very still in the hallway, heart hammering, one hand pressed flat against the wall as if he could feel through the plaster whether these strangers were lying. We felt what happened. How could anyone have felt anything? Unless they meant the magic. Unless there were people out there who knew about magic, who could sense it the way you'd sense a fire from its heat. And if that was true, then these two strangers on his doorstep might know things about him that even he didn't know. And that thought was somehow more frightening than the belt had ever been. "I don't know you," Harry said through the door, and was faintly surprised at how clear and unshaking his own voice came out. "And I'm not opening the door for strangers." There was a short pause, and then the shorter man's voice, gruffer, quicker, with an accent Harry couldn't place, not English, something harder-edged. "Smart kid. Good instinct. Keep it. A beat. Look, we're not gonna break the door down if that's what you're worried about. We can wait out here as long as you need. But you got burns on your arm we can smell from out here, kid, and a house that smells like fear's been livin' in it a real long time, and we didn't come 3,000 miles to leave without at least mackin' sure you're okay." Harry's breath caught. Smell. Not a figure of speech. The man had said it like a literal fact, like he'd caught the scent the way a dog would. That was impossible. That was, well, Harry thought, with the particular flat clarity of someone who'd blown up an ant and made light bulbs explode with his mind less than 12 hours ago. Impossible doesn't really mean what it used to. "Prove it," Harry said. "Prove you're not, I don't know, prove you're not here to hurt me, or take me somewhere." Another pause, longer this time, and when the woman spoke again, her voice had changed, softer, and something in it made Harry's chest ache in a way he didn't have a name for yet. "We can't prove intentions through a door, sweetheart, but I can tell you this. My name is Oraro Munro. I grew up on the streets of Cairo, stealing to survive, until a man offered me a home and never once asked me to be anything other than what I was. The man beside me, his name is Logan, and he has killed more men than either of us would care to count, and he has never once raised a hand against a child, and he never will. We run a school, not an ordinary school, a school for children who are different. The way you're different. We're not here because we want something from you, Harry. We're here because Charles, the man who runs our school, felt you last night, 3,000 miles away, in more pain than any child should ever be in, and he sent us to see if you needed somewhere safer to be. Harry's hand was shaking on the doorknob, though he wasn't sure if it was from fear or something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to hope, a feeling he had trained himself over 10 hard years never to indulge. "I can't leave," he heard himself say, and hated how small his voice suddenly sounded. "I have to live here. It's the rule. My aunt and uncle are my only family. There's some kind of protection, my aunt said once. Some reason I have to stay here, even though—" He stopped. He didn't actually know why he had to stay. Nobody had ever told him. It had simply always been understood, the way the sky was blue and the cupboard was his, an immovable fact of his existence that had never once been explained. Through the door he heard the woman exhale, slow and careful. "Harry, whatever your aunt told you, I promise you, no rule in this world requires a child to be beaten in his own home. Nothing that calls itself protection should look like what happened to your arm last night." Something in Harry's chest cracked, quietly, like ice under too much weight, and before he'd fully decided to, he found his hand turning the lock and pulling the door open. They were both smaller than he'd somehow imagined, standing there in the flesh. Not smaller in stature, but smaller in the way that made them feel less like the terrifying strangers his imagination had built, and more like people. Oddly, painfully kind-looking people, standing on a very ordinary doorstep in a very ordinary English suburb. Aurora's eyes were a startling, pale blue-white, and when she looked at him, really looked, taking in the bruise blooming dark along his cheekbone, the welt on his forearm, the too thin wrists, the clothes several sizes too big. Something moved across her face, quick and sharp, gone almost before Harry could name it as grief. "Hey there," Logan said, crouching slightly so he was more at Harry's eye level, and up close Harry could see the man's eyes were an odd amber brown, sharp and watchful, cataloging everything about the hallway behind Harry in a single sweeping glance, the broken glass, the cupboard door hanging slightly open, the thin blanket still crumpled on the stairs, and something tightened at the corner of his jaw. "You mind if we come in? Just to talk? Door stays open the whole time, you say the word and we're gone, no hard feelings." Harry stepped back to let them in, though every muscle in his body stayed coiled and ready to run, ready to fight, ready for whatever came next. Logan didn't sit down on the sofa when Petunia's pristine living room offered it. He crouched instead, right there on the carpet, bringing himself down low, unthreatening, and Aurora settled into an armchair with the careful economy of someone who understood exactly how much space a frightened child needed. "Tell me what happened last night," Aurora said gently. "You don't have to tell us everything. Just whatever you're comfortable with." Harry looked between them for a long moment, weighing something he couldn't quite articulate. 10 years of silence. 10 years of a very specific kind of secret-keeping that had less to do with magic and more to do with shame. The deep certainty that nobody wanted to hear about it, that nobody would believe him even if he told, that speaking it aloud would somehow only make it more real and more permanent. But there was something in the way both of these strangers were sitting, low and patient and utterly unhurried, like they had all the time in the world and nowhere better to be than right here on Petunia Dursley's carpet. That made the words come loose almost against his will. "My uncle hits me sometimes," Harry said, flat, testing the words in his own mouth like they might explode. "When he's angry, He was angry last night about a broken dish. He hit me with his belt and then he stopped. This was the part that felt impossible to say out loud even now, even with the memory of it still crawling under his skin. Something happened. Lights broke. There was electricity, I think, all over me, and he couldn't touch me anymore. It just stopped him. Logan's jaw was tight, a muscle working there, and his eyes had gone very still and very dark. But his voice when he spoke stayed level and calm, deliberately so. That's not the first time something strange happened around you, is it, kid? It wasn't a question, not really, and Harry found himself shaking his head slowly. Since I was little, things just happen. I set a snake loose at the zoo once. My hair used to grow back overnight when my aunt cut it. I fell off the roof of my school once and just floated, sort of landed like nothing happened. My uncle always said it was freakish, unnatural. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he hated it. Hated the way 10 years of that word had lodged itself somewhere behind his ribs like a splinter that had never come out clean. It's not unnatural, Aurora said, and there was iron under the gentleness now, something absolutely unshakable in the way she said it. Harry, listen to me. What's inside you is not a curse. It is not a shame. There are people all over this world who are born the way you were born, different, gifted, sometimes in ways that terrify the people around them because they don't understand it. Some of us can control the weather. She let that sit for a moment, watching his eyes widen slightly. Some of us heal from wounds that would kill an ordinary man in seconds. A glance at Logan, who huffed out something that wasn't quite a laugh. There is an entire school built for children like us, like you, where nobody will ever call you a freak for what you are, because what you are is the same thing every single person under that roof already is. Harry sat very still, absorbing that, turning it over like a stone in his hand, looking for the trick in it, the catch, the part where it all fell apart the way every good thing in his life eventually fell apart. You're saying there's a school for people like me. I'm saying there's a home, Aurora corrected softly. The school's just the part that happens during the day. Something about the word home, spoken so simply, so without qualification, hit Harry harder than he expected, and he had to look down at his hands for a moment to keep his eyes from doing something embarrassing. What happens? He said finally, carefully. If I say number, if I say I want to stay here. Logan's expression didn't change, but something in his voice went very quiet and very serious. Then we walk right back out that door and you never see us again, and we'll figure out some other way to make sure nobody in this house ever lays a hand on you again, because that part's not negotiable, kid, whether you come with us or not. But if you're asking whether we're gonna drag you out of here against your will, he shook his head once firm. Never gonna happen. Not how we do things. You get a choice. Might be the first real choice anybody's ever given you, way this house looks, but you get one now. Harry looked at the broken glass still scattered in the hallway, at the cupboard door hanging slightly open on its restored hinges, at the thin blanket on the stairs that had been the closest thing to a bed he'd ever known, and felt something in his chest, something that had been clenched tight for 10 years, begin, very slowly, very cautiously, to loosen. If I go, he said slowly, and it's terrible, can I leave? Any time you want, Aurora said immediately. Nobody keeps anyone at that school who doesn't want to be there. And if people there decide I'm a freak too. Something flickered across Logan's face, brief and fierce, something that looked almost like anger on Harry's behalf. Then you tell me and I'll deal with it personally, he said, and there was a weight to the promise that made Harry believe, instantly and completely, that he meant it in the most literal possible sense. Harry sat with the silence for a long moment, listening to the ordinary tick of Petunia's kitchen clock, the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the street, the sound of an entirely ordinary summer morning continuing on around a conversation that was anything but ordinary. And then, in a voice that was quiet but did not shake, He said the two words that would end up rewriting the shape of two entire hidden worlds, though none of them, not Harry, not Aurora, not Logan, and certainly not the old man in England who was, at that very moment, penning a letter addressed to a boy who would never receive it, had any idea yet how far the ripples would spread. "I'll go." He packed almost nothing, a single change of clothes too big for him, a photograph he'd once stolen from Petunia's album of a woman with his own green eyes laughing at a camera, the one thing in the house he actually wanted to keep. Logan stood in the doorway of the cupboard while Harry gathered what little he had, and Harry watched the man's face do something complicated when he saw the space properly, the low ceiling, the single blanket, the small shelf of broken toy soldiers that had been the only decoration Harry had ever been permitted. "This where you slept," Logan said. It wasn't quite a question. 10 years, Harry said, and was almost surprised by how steady his own voice was. Logan didn't say anything for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way that had nothing to do with anger at all. "Not anymore." They left through the front door in broad daylight, and nobody on Privet Drive noticed a single thing. No curtain twitched, no neighbor peered out, the whole street continuing its dull, ordinary Tuesday morning, entirely unaware that history had just quietly rerouted itself on their doorstep. Aurora led him down the road toward a black car parked 2 streets over, and as they walked, the sky above them, which had been clear and blue all morning without a cloud in sight, began, very gently, to fill with soft white clouds, moving in slow, deliberate patterns that Harry realized with a jolt were following her. "You did that," he said, staring upward. "I did," Aurora agreed, and there was something like pride in it, easy and unashamed, a complete absence of the fear he'd have expected from anyone else discussing something so plainly impossible. "Weather listens to me. It took years to learn how to ask nicely instead of demanding. Can you teach me things like that?" "I can teach you all sorts of things," she said, glancing sideways at him with an expression that was almost a smile. "Though I suspect your gift and mine aren't going to work quite the same way. There's something in you I've never felt before, Harry. Something old, tangled up with the new part. It might take all of us working together to understand it properly." Harry turned that thought over as they reached the car, sleek, black, nothing like anything that had ever driven down Privet Drive, and Logan opened the door for him with a small, oddly formal gesture that made Harry, despite everything, almost laugh. "One more thing," Logan said before Harry climbed in, crouching down to his level one more time, his amber eyes serious and steady. "Whatever happens at that school, whatever anybody says to you, however scared some of these other kids might look when their own stuff first come out, you remember something for me, okay? What happened to you in that house wasn't your fault, wasn't ever your fault. You didn't do anything to deserve any of it, and you don't owe nobody an explanation for being exactly what you are. You got that?" Harry looked at him for a long moment, at this strange, gruff, fierce stranger who had crouched down on his aunt's living room carpet and made him a promise with the weight of an oath behind it, and felt something inside him, something that had been braced and flinching and small for 10 straight years, finally, quietly begin to stand up straight. "I've got it," Harry said. The car pulled away from the curb a moment later, and behind them, Privet Drive continued its ordinary Tuesday, sprinklers hissing, curtains squeaking clean, utterly unaware that the boy who had spent a decade sleeping in a cupboard under the stairs of Number 4 was gone, and was never, under any circumstances, coming back. Chapter 2. Iron and Instinct. The mansion looked, from the sky, like something out of a story Harry had never been allowed to read, sprawling and gray-stoned, ringed by trees so tall they seemed to hold up the clouds themselves, with a lake glinting silver off to the east and lawns so green and so vast that Harry's first thought, staring down through the small oval window of the jet, was that someone must spend an awful lot of time mowing. "That's home," Ororo said, watching his face rather than the view. "For as long as you want it to be." Harry didn't answer. He'd spent the entire flight in a state somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. He had, after all, just watched the English countryside shrink away beneath a plane that had no visible engines making noise, flown by a man who occasionally hummed old rock songs under his breath while checking instruments that looked like something from the front cover of one of Dudley's video game magazines. He'd stopped trying to categorize anything as impossible somewhere over the Atlantic. It seemed like a waste of energy. The jet touched down in an underground hangar lit by long white strips of fluorescent light, and the ramp lowered with a hiss of hydraulics into a cavernous space full of machinery Harry couldn't begin to name. Sleek black vehicles, walls lined with what looked like weapons lockers, a floor so polished it threw back his own reflection, small and wide-eyed and utterly out of his depth. He gripped the strap of his bag tighter and followed Ororo and Logan down the ramp, doing his level best not to look as overwhelmed as he felt. A man was waiting for them at the bottom, seated in a wheelchair that gleamed like it had been built rather than bought, his head bald and his eyes a pale, startling blue that seemed to hold both great age and great gentleness at once. He didn't rush forward. He simply waited, hands folded in his lap, and let Harry come to him at his own pace, which Harry noticed, and without quite understanding why, appreciated. "Hello, Harry," the man said, and his voice had a warmth to it that reminded Harry painfully of something he'd never actually had, the voice a father might use in the version of his life that had never happened. "My name is Charles Xavier. I run this school. I want you to know that nobody here is going to ask anything of you that you're not ready to give, and nobody here is going to make you feel, for one single moment, that you are anything less than exactly who you are." Harry studied him for a long moment, the way he'd learned to study every adult who'd ever spoken kindly to him, searching for the crack, the catch, the moment the kindness would reveal itself as performance. He didn't find one. That unsettled him more than finding one would have. "You're the one who," Harry hesitated, "felt me last night." "I did," Xavier said simply. "I have a gift very similar to your own. In one narrow respect, I can hear minds, Harry, the way you might hear a shout across a crowded room. Yours was the loudest thing I've ever felt in 30 years of listening." A small, careful smile. "I should tell you plainly because I think you deserve plain things after the life you've had. I will never read your thoughts without your permission. Not once. Not ever. What I heard last night was involuntary on both our parts. From this point forward, your mind is yours alone unless you choose to share it." Something in Harry's chest, wound tight since the moment he'd stepped onto the jet, loosened by another degree. Nobody had ever asked his permission for anything in his entire life. The idea that someone might, as a matter of course, simply extend it to him without being asked, felt almost dizzying. "Okay," Harry said, because he didn't have a bigger word for what he was feeling, and Xavier's smile widened slightly, like the small word had told him everything he needed to know. They gave him a room of his own on the 3rd floor, an actual room, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the lake, and a desk with drawers that opened and closed without sticking, and Harry stood in the doorway for a long moment after Ororo showed him in, simply staring, because he had never in his life had a space that belonged only to him, not shared with spiders and rusted pipes, not measured by how much air fit inside a cupboard door. "There are clothes in the wardrobe," Ororo said gently, watching him take it in. "Hank, Dr. McCoy, you'll meet him properly this afternoon, guest at sizes. If nothing fits, we'll fix it. Bathrooms just down the hall, shared with 2 other boys your age, both good kids. Breakfast is whenever you're hungry. There's a kitchen staff, but half the older students cook for themselves most mornings anyway. Curfew's 9 on school nights. later in summer. Professor Xavier will want to talk with you properly once you've had a chance to settle, but there's no rush. Today, just breathe. Look around. You don't have to decide anything about anything today. Harry sat down on the edge of the bed once she'd gone, testing the mattress with a kind of disbelieving caution, and found himself laughing. A short, strange, almost painful sound, because it was softer than anything he'd ever slept on, and the absurdity of that being the thing that finally cracked something open in him struck him as almost funny. He lay back, fully clothed, shoes and all, and stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in 10 years fell asleep in broad daylight without a single thought of locks or belts or bear bulbs, and slept for 11 straight hours. He woke to knocking, hesitant and rhythmic, and blinked up at a ceiling that took a full 3 seconds to remember wasn't the underside of a staircase. Sunlight had shifted to the golden slant of early evening. His stomach growled loud enough to embarrass him. "Hello!" A voice called through the door, bright, slightly accented, clearly trying very hard to sound casual and not quite managing it. "I know you're probably sleeping or, adjusting or whatever, but Aurora said you might be hungry and dinner's actually pretty good tonight. And also I'm nosy, so." Harry sat up, ran a hand through hair that had never once in his life laid flat, and opened the door to find a girl about his own age standing there, dark hair, a mischievous, open sort of face, wearing what looked like an ordinary t-shirt except that as he watched, her hand passed straight through the doorframe like it wasn't there at all, and she yanked it back with a sheepish grimace. "Sorry," she said. "Still get twitchy sometimes when I'm nervous, phase right through stuff without meaning to. I'm Kitty, Kitty Pryde." "You're Harry, right? The one everybody's whispering about. People are whispering about me. Charles' reading last night practically blew a fuse in Cerebro," Kitty said, matter of fact, clearly delighted to be the bearer of gossip. "Word travels fast around here. Come on, I'll walk you down. The dining hall's a maze if you don't know it. First week I lived here, I ended up in the boiler room twice trying to find the kitchen." Harry followed her down a wide staircase that had absolutely nothing in common with the narrow one he'd spent 10 years sleeping beneath, past hallways lined with framed photographs of students in matching uniforms, past a room where he glimpsed, through an open door, a boy floating an inch above an armchair while reading a comic book with total unconcern, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Which Harry supposed here, it might genuinely be. The dining hall was loud in a way Harry's entire body flinched from on instinct. A long table crowded with maybe a dozen kids his age and older, all talking over each other, plates being passed, someone's fork stuck, apparently on purpose, to the ceiling by way of demonstration. A boy with close-cropped hair and ruby-red glasses that seemed slightly too dark for indoor wear glanced up as they entered and gave Harry a short, appraising nod that was somehow both welcoming and faintly military. "Scott Summers," he said, extending a hand. "You're the new kid Storm and Logan flew out for. Heard the readings were off the charts." "I don't really know what that means," Harry admitted. "Means you're either gonna be terrifyingly strong once you learn to control it, or terrifyingly dangerous if you don't," said a girl further down the table, red-headed, green-eyed, with a calm, appraising sort of gaze that made Harry feel briefly, oddly, like she could see straight through him. "I'm Jean. Don't worry, we'll help you land on the right side of that." "Jean can read minds too," Kitty said, sliding into a seat and patting the one beside her for Harry. "Not as strong as the professor yet, but she's getting there. Fair warning, she'll know if you're lying about liking the meatloaf." "The meatloaf's fine," Harry said cautiously, and Jean laughed, a real laugh, easy and unguarded, and said, "See, that's a lie but a polite one, so I'll allow it." A boy across the table with unusually blue-tinted skin, and what looked distinctly like a tail flicking lazily behind his chair leaned forward with an easy grin. "Kurt Wagner," he said, in an accent Harry placed somewhere vaguely German. "You should know, Everyone here looked exactly as terrified their first week as you look right now. It gets better, mostly, a beat. Also, I can teleport in case the tale did not give it away. You can teleport. Yeah. It smells like brimstone. Everyone complains. I've stopped apologizing for it. Kurt shrugged, entirely unbothered, and popped a piece of bread into his mouth. What is your thing? Storm wouldn't say, just kept looking very serious about it, which around here usually means something big. Harry hesitated, fork hovering over a plate that Kitty had piled generously without asking, aware suddenly that every face at the table had turned toward him with open, unguarded curiosity, not the wary, calculating attention he'd grown up expecting from every new adult, but something simpler and warmer. Kids his own age just genuinely wanting to know him. I don't really know yet, he admitted, and it was true. The storm, the static, the shattered bulbs, none of it had come with an instruction manual. Things have always just happened around me since I was little. Last night was the first time it felt like it was actually mine instead of just happening to me. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked at him strangely. Scott just nodded, slow and understanding, and said, "Yeah, that's basically everybody's story here, one way or another. You'll get the hang of it. We've got a whole facility built for exactly that." It was such a small thing, being believed without argument, without a single raised eyebrow, that Harry had to look down at his plate for a moment to keep his face from doing something embarrassing. 2 days later, Xavier called him into the study for what he called, gently, a bit of a talk before we let Hank run any tests, and Harry sat across the wide oak desk feeling the familiar tightening in his gut that any adult wanting to talk had always produced in him. "You're not in trouble," Xavier said immediately. "Reading, no," Harry corrected himself, probably just seeing the tension in his shoulders. "I want to ask you some questions, and I want you to know you can decline to answer any of them, and nothing about your place here changes either way." "Okay," Harry said, guarded. "You mentioned to Aurora that strange things had been happening around you since you were very young, long before whatever happened the night we found you. Yeah. Can you describe some of them?" Harry thought about it, really thought, for the first time laying it all out in a row rather than burying each incident the moment it happened, the way he'd trained himself to. "My hair grew back the day after my aunt shaved it all off, trying to make me normal. I made a jumper my aunt knitted for me shrink until it looked like a doll's sweater. I floated off a roof once instead of falling. I set a boa constrictor loose at the zoo just by, talking to it, kind of, except I don't remember deciding to talk to it, it just happened. And there's," he stopped. "Go on," Xavier said gently. "There's a scar," Harry said, and reached up unconsciously to touch the thin lightning bolt mark half hidden beneath his fringe. "My aunt said I got it in the car crash that killed my parents. She's never said anything more than that. But sometimes it aches, not all the time. Just sometimes, like it's remembering something." Xavier went very still for a moment, his pale eyes narrowing slightly, not with alarm exactly, but with the sharp, careful focus of a man encountering a puzzle piece he hadn't expected. "May I look? Not your mind," he added quickly, seeing Harry's flinch. "Just the scar itself." Harry pushed his fringe back, and Xavier leaned forward slightly, studying the mark with an intensity that made Harry unaccountably self-conscious. "That is not the scar left by a car accident," Xavier said, finally, quietly. "I've seen a great many wounds, Harry, in a great many forms. That mark was left by something far more violent and far more deliberate than a collision. I don't know what caused it, but I don't believe your aunt was telling you the truth." Harry sat with that for a long moment, something cold and unfamiliar settling in his stomach. 10 years of a lie so simple he'd never once questioned it. "Then what happened to my parents?" "I don't know," Xavier said honestly, "but I intend to find out if you'd like me to. In the meantime, I want to run some tests. Nothing invasive, nothing frightening." Hank is a scientist as well as a teacher, and a very gentle one. We simply want to understand what we're working with, so that, when you're ready to start training, we know how best to help you." Harry looked at him for a long moment, weighing the offer the way he'd learned, painfully, to weigh every offer anyone had ever made him. But there was nothing in Xavier's face except patience, and something that might have been the beginning of real affection, and Harry found himself nodding before he'd quite decided to. "Okay," he said. "Let's find out what I am." Hank McCoy turned out to be an enormous, blue-furred man, with hands the size of dinner plates, and a voice so soft and precise that the contrast between his appearance and his manner nearly made Harry laugh out loud the first time he spoke. He ran Harry through a series of scans in a lab that smelled like antiseptic and ozone, all the while narrating each test in a running, cheerful commentary that somehow made the whole process feel less like an examination and more like a conversation between two people equally curious about the same fascinating puzzle. "Blood work's going to take a day or two to fully process," Hank said, adjusting a set of dials on a machine that hummed pleasantly beside Harry's chair. "But I can tell you right now, preliminarily, your baseline readings are unlike anything in our database. There's a genetic marker consistent with mutation, yes, quite a strong one, but there's something else layered underneath it, something that doesn't match any known human genome pattern I've cataloged. Almost like, and forgive me, this is purely a working theory, almost like two separate systems of power evolved to run through the same body and only recently began actually communicating with each other." "Is that bad?" Harry asked. "Bad?" Hank looked almost offended by the suggestion. "Harry, that's extraordinary. Most mutations express as one specific ability, refined over a lifetime. What I'm seeing in you looks like a foundation broad enough to support several, possibly interacting in ways we've genuinely never documented. I'd wager money, not that I gamble, mind poor use of a scientist's salary, that whatever happened to you the other night wasn't the full extent of what you're capable of. Not even close." "So what do we do?" Hank smiled, and there was something almost gleeful in it, the smile of a man who loved his work more than almost anything else in the world. "We test it properly, carefully, in a controlled environment built for exactly this purpose." The danger room, as it turned out, was nothing like Harry expected, though he hadn't actually had time to build much of an expectation before Logan led him down a series of elevators into a sub-basement level colder and more industrial than anything above ground, ending at a set of blast doors thick enough to have come off a bank vault. "This is where we figure out what you can do," Logan said, punching a code into a panel beside the doors. "Controlled environment, walls that can take a beating, safety systems that'll shut everything down the second things get out of hand. You're not gonna hurt anybody in here, and nobody's gonna hurt you. That's the whole point." The doors slid open onto a vast, empty chamber, gray and featureless, easily the size of a football pitch, ringed by a glassed-in observation deck where Harry could see Xavier, Hank, Ororo, and Jean already waiting, watching through the reinforced window with the calm, focused attention of scientists about to witness an experiment they'd been anticipating for days. "So what do I actually do?" Harry asked, standing alone in the middle of the vast gray space, feeling small in a way that had nothing to do with the room's size. "Whatever comes naturally," came Xavier's voice, piped in through a speaker overhead, warm and unhurried. "We'll start simple. Hank's going to run a low-level simulation, nothing dangerous, just something to give your instincts a target. React however feels right. There's no wrong answer here, Harry. We're not testing you. We're getting to know you." The lights dimmed, and the far wall of the chamber shimmered and dissolved into an image so convincing Harry actually took a step back. A rocky, storm-lashed cliff edge, rendered in perfect, holographic detail, complete with the smell of salt air pumped through hidden vents. A shape detached itself from the simulated shadows, roughly humanoid, glowing faintly at the edges to mark it as a construct rather than a real threat, and advanced toward him at a slow, deliberate walk. Harry's first instinct, old, deep, trained by 10 years of learning to make himself small and unnoticeable, was to run. He felt his body tense toward flight, muscle memory screaming at him to duck, to hide, to disappear into whatever shadow was nearest. But there was no cupboard here. No corner to fold himself into, just open space and a construct advancing, and somewhere behind the glass, people watching who had promised him, over and over in the 2 days since he'd arrived, that nothing that happened to him here would ever be his fault. So instead of running, Harry planted his feet and reached, not with his hands, but with something further down, something that had woken up 2 nights ago in a cupboard under a staircase and had been humming quietly under his skin ever since, waiting for permission. The air around him crackled. It happened faster than anyone in the observation room was prepared for. A sudden, violent discharge of electricity that leapt from Harry's outstretched hands not as a controlled bolt, but as a wide, chaotic arc, striking the construct dead center and blowing it apart into scattering fragments of light before it had covered half the distance toward him. The overhead lights in the training chamber flickered and dimmed as the surge drew power from somewhere Harry didn't understand and couldn't have named. "Sweet mother of," Logan muttered, leaning forward against the glass. "Cut the simulation," Xavier said quickly, though his voice held more fascination than alarm. Harry, can you hear me? Are you all right?" Harry stood in the middle of the empty chamber, breathing hard, staring down at his own hands like he'd never seen them before. The static had already faded, but he could still feel the ghost of it, a warm hum under his skin, something that had answered his call the instant he'd asked it to, no hesitation, no resistance, like it had been waiting his entire life for exactly this permission. "I'm fine," he called back, and found to his own surprise that he meant it, more than fine, actually, buzzing with something that felt disconcertingly close to joy. "Can we do that again?" There was a beat of silence from the observation deck, and then Jean's voice, half laughing, came through the speaker. "I think that's a yes from the professor." They ran him through a dozen more simulations over the next hour, each one slightly more complex than the last, and Harry found with each pass that the power responded more precisely, more willingly, the raw chaotic discharge of the first attempt gradually sharpening into something he could actually direct, a focused arc here, a controlled burst there, once astonishingly a barrier of crackling blue-white energy that sprang up around him, unbidden the instant a simulated projectile came too close, deflecting it without Harry consciously willing it to happen at all. "That's instinctive defense," Hank said, half to himself, scribbling notes on a tablet with barely contained excitement. "Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Most mutant abilities require years to develop even basic reflexive control. You're doing it on your 3rd simulation. Is that good or is that terrifying?" Harry asked, only half joking, watching the last construct dissolve into scattered light at his feet. "Both, currently," Xavier admitted, and there was something careful in his voice now, something that hadn't been there before. "Harry, I want you to try something for me. Nothing aggressive. Just reach for it, the way you've been reaching, but don't direct it anywhere. Just let it come and tell me what you feel." Harry closed his eyes and reached inward, past the electricity that had become almost familiar now, down toward something further, something he'd felt stirring at the very edges of his awareness during the last simulation but hadn't dared touch, an older thing, quieter, threaded through the newer power like a second voice speaking underneath the first. The air around him changed. It wasn't electricity this time. It was something warmer, heavier, a golden shimmer that spread outward from his chest in a slow pulse. And for one impossible second, every object in the training chamber, the scattered fragments of dissolved holographic light. A stray metal panel loosened by the earlier discharge, even faintly. The dust motes hanging in the air seemed to bend toward him, drawn in like iron filings toward a magnet, before the moment passed and everything settled back into stillness. Up in the observation room, Xavier had gone very pale, one hand pressed flat against the glass. "Charles," Aurora said quietly, watching his face. "What was that?" "That," Xavier said slowly, "was not a mutant ability. Not one I've ever catalogued, at least. That felt old, Aurora. Old the way certain forms of magic in very old legends are described as old. I have felt something similar only once before, faintly, years ago, and I dismissed it as imagination." He turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that was, for the first time since Harry's arrival, genuinely unsettled. "I don't think Harry is only a mutant. I think something in him predates mutation entirely, and the two have somehow become entangled. I don't know what that means yet, but I think we may need to be very, very careful about who else learns what we're seeing in this room." Down on the floor, Harry opened his eyes, the golden shimmer already fading from his skin, and looked up at the observation window with an expression of open, unguarded wonder that made every adult behind that glass fall quiet for a long moment. "Did you see that?" he called up, breathless, grinning in a way none of them had yet seen on his face. "I don't even know what that was." "Neither do we, kid," Logan said, and there was something rough and proud in his voice that made Harry's chest ache in the good way this time. "But whatever it is, you didn't even flinch. Most people, first time something that big comes out of them, they about wet themselves. You just asked if you could do it again." "Should I be scared of it?" Harry asked, and it wasn't a rhetorical question. It was the question of a boy who had spent 10 years being told his own existence was something to fear, genuinely asking whether this, too, was something he needed to hide. Xavier's voice came through the speaker, warm and absolutely certain. "No, Harry, you should never be afraid of what you are. Only careful and thoughtful about how you choose to use it. There's a very great difference between the two, and I intend to make sure you always know exactly which one you're standing in." 3,000 miles away, on a bright, ordinary Tuesday that felt, to everyone involved, entirely unremarkable until it very suddenly wasn't, Rubeus Hagrid arrived at Number 4 Privet Drive on Albus Dumbledore's instruction, carrying a heavy cream envelope addressed in emerald ink to Mr. H. Potter. The cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive. He knocked twice, cheerfully, expecting the small, thin, dark-haired boy Dumbledore had described to him a decade ago in careful, guarded terms. Watch him from a distance only, Hagrid. The wards must not be disturbed, and was met instead by Vernon Dursley, gray-faced and hollow-eyed in a way that had nothing to do with Hagrid's considerable size, wrenching the door open with the manner of a man who had clearly not slept properly in several nights. "He's not here," Vernon said, before Hagrid had gotten a single word out, his voice cracking on the edge of something Hagrid couldn't quite place, not grief, not quite fear, something closer to a deep, unsettled dread. "The boy's gone. Left. Days ago. Don't know where, don't much care, so if you're here about him you can turn right back around and—" "Gone," Hagrid repeated, and something in his broad, kindly face went suddenly very serious. "Gone where? He's 11 years old, Mr. Dursley, he can't have just—" "I don't know," Vernon snapped, and there was real panic bleeding through the anger now, plain as day. "Woke up one morning and he was gone, no note, no nothing, took a few clothes and just vanished. And good riddance, if you want my honest opinion, that boy was never—" He stopped himself, some flicker of self-preservation catching up with his temper, and his eyes darted, involuntarily, to the ruined light fixtures still visible in the hallway behind him, glass never properly swept up, several bulbs still hanging in jagged, half-melted shards. Hagrid followed his glance, and his broad face went pale beneath his enormous beard. "What happened in there?" Hagrid said very quietly in a voice that had gone flat and dangerous in a way that made Vernon Dursley take an involuntary step backward. "Nothing," Vernon said, too fast. "Storm damage. Freak weather. Now if you don't mind." The door slammed shut in Hagrid's face, and he stood on the step for a long moment, the cream envelope still clutched in one massive hand, staring at the ruined light fixtures visible through the frosted glass, feeling a cold, creeping dread settle in his stomach that had nothing at all to do with the summer heat. He didn't bother knocking again. He turned instead and walked straight back down the garden path to where he'd left his flying motorbike parked awkwardly across two neighboring driveways, and within the hour he was standing in Albus Dumbledore's office at Hogwarts, twisting the unopened letter in his enormous hands while the headmaster listened to his account with an expression that grew steadily, alarmingly still. "Gone," Dumbledore repeated, very softly, once Hagrid had finished. He rose from behind his desk and crossed to the window, looking out over the grounds with his hands folded behind his back, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. "That should not be possible, Hagrid. The wards around that house are older and deeper than almost any protection I have ever cast. They are bound to his mother's blood and to his presence within those walls. He should not have been able to simply leave." "Maybe someone took him," Hagrid said, his voice thick with worry. "Maybe someone got in past your wards, Professor, and—" "No," Dumbledore said, and there was something in his voice now that Hagrid had rarely heard there before, not fear exactly, but something close enough to unsettle him deeply. "If someone had broken those wards by force, I would have known instantly. Every alarm tied to that house would have sounded the moment the barrier fell. Nothing sounded, Hagrid, which means either the wards were never truly broken at all." He paused, and turned from the window, his blue eyes, usually so twinkling and warm, now sharp and cold with a calculation that made Hagrid distinctly uneasy. "Or something walked straight through them as though they had never been there at all. And I confess, Hagrid, in all my years, I have never once encountered a force capable of doing that to blood wards of that depth." He was quiet for a long moment, turning the unopened letter over in his own hands now, the cream envelope suddenly looking, in the fading afternoon light of his office, like a very small and very inadequate thing. "Send word to the Ministry that the delivery has been postponed," Dumbledore said finally. "Quietly, Hagrid. I don't want panic. Not yet. And send an owl to Minerva. I think it's time we found out precisely what has become of Harry Potter before anyone else does." Outside, far beyond the castle's ancient windows, the sky over the Scottish Highlands had gone strangely, uncharacteristically still, as though even the weather itself sensed that somewhere across an ocean, a boy who had once been the most carefully hidden child in the wizarding world had just taken his first true, unguarded breath of freedom, and that whatever came next for both worlds that claimed some piece of him would never again be simple. Chapter 3. Letters from Two Worlds. 3 weeks into his life at the mansion, Harry Potter learned how to throw a punch that didn't rely on magic at all, and he learned it from Logan, in a gym that smelled like sweat and rubber mats, on a gray Thursday morning when the rest of the students were still asleep. "Lightning's great," Logan said, circling him slowly, hands loose and ready. "Electricity, whatever that gold thing is you did the other week, all real useful. But you're 11 years old and about the size of a wet cat, and someday you're gonna be somewhere your powers don't work, or somebody's gonna clip you from behind before you even know they're there. Body's gotta know how to fight even when the fancy stuff's offline." "You want me to hit you?" Harry said, skeptical, eyeing the sheer bulk of the man in front of him. "I want you to try," Logan said, grinning around the unlit cigar he insisted on chewing during training even though Aurora had banned him from lighting them indoors. "Go on. Anywhere you like," Harry threw the punch. Logan caught his wrist without seeming to move very fast at all, redirected the momentum with a small twist, and Harry found himself flat on his back on the mat, staring up at the ceiling, more startled than hurt. "Again," Logan said, offering a hand up. "Except this time, watch my hips before you swing, not my face. Face lies, hips don't." They did it 40 more times that morning, and by the end of it, Harry had landed exactly one real hit, a glancing blow to Logan's ribs that made the man grunt in genuine, surprised approval rather than the indulgent way he'd been grunting for the first 30 attempts. And Harry walked out of that gym sore in muscles he hadn't known he owned, and happier than he could remember being in longer than he wanted to think about. It became a rhythm over those weeks. Mornings with Logan, learning to fight with his hands the same patient, repetitive way other kids learn times tables. Afternoons in the danger room, where Hank charted every new discovery with barely restrained delight. The electricity had a name now, or the closest thing to one Hank could offer. A kind of raw bioelectric field generation unlike anything in the mutant registry. And the golden pull, the strange gravity that bent small objects toward him when he reached for it, remained stubbornly unexplained, filed under a growing folder Hank had started simply labeling anomalous. Evenings belonged to the other kids, Kitty teaching him to play a card game that involved considerably more cheating by phasing through the deck than the rules technically allowed. Kurt performing increasingly reckless teleportation, tricks off the roof for an audience of delighted, horrified younger students. Jean quietly, patiently teaching him small tricks of mental discipline that had nothing to do with telepathy, and everything to do with simply learning to sit still inside his own head without flinching from it. He was, for the first time in his life, becoming something other than a boy defined by absence, not the freak in the cupboard, not the thing to be hidden and fed just enough to survive. He was becoming, slowly and without anyone forcing the process, someone with friends, with mornings that had a shape he chose, with a body that was starting, however slowly, to trust its own strength. He didn't know, during any of those 3 weeks, that across an ocean, 2 entirely separate hidden governments had begun, independently and with mounting alarm, to search for him. Cornelius Fudge did not like surprises, and he particularly did not like surprises that arrived in the form of a hand-delivered report from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's Tracking Division, informing him that the underage magic detection charms tied to the residence of one Harry James Potter had registered on the night of the 11th of July. A magical discharge so massive it had overloaded 3 separate ministry-linked ward stones and temporarily blown out the entire network's regional monitoring array. Overloaded, Fudge repeated, standing in his office with the report clutched in one trembling hand, sweating despite the cool charm on the room. "Amelia, explain to me how a 10-year-old boy overloads a ward station built to withstand a rogue dragon." Amelia Bones, head of magical law enforcement, did not look remotely amused. "I can't, Minister. That's rather the point of my report. Whatever discharged from that house that night wasn't ordinary accidental magic. Our best analysts are calling it, and I quote, a magical signature inconsistent with known human capability." And then 3 days later, the detection wards attached to that address went dark entirely. Not damaged, not tampered with, simply off, as though whatever they were monitoring had ceased to exist within their range. Which means what, precisely? Which means the boy is gone, Minister. Nobody at that house, Muggle or otherwise. Dumbledore's man went round to deliver the Hogwarts letter and found the family in something close to a state of collapse. The uncle wouldn't say a word beyond insisting the boy had run off in the night. Fudge sat down heavily, the report still trembling in his hand. He was not, whatever his critics said behind his back, A stupid man, merely a cautious one. A man who had built an entire career on the careful, unglamorous work of keeping the wizarding world stable, invisible, undisturbed by scandal or panic. And nothing in his 15 years at the ministry had prepared him for the particular flavor of dread currently settling into his stomach. The boy who lived, the single most politically important child in Britain, the living symbol around which an entire post-war recovery had been quietly built, had simply vanished, and something powerful enough to overwhelm ministry-grade wards had been the last thing anyone detected before he did. "Find him," Fudge said, finally. Quietly. "I don't care what it costs. I don't care whose feathers get ruffled at the DMLE or the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Find that boy before the papers find out he's missing, and find out what in Merlin's name is powerful enough to make ministry wards go dark like a snuffed candle." Albus Dumbledore's investigation moved along parallel lines, though with considerably less official machinery behind it and considerably more personal urgency. He sat in his office late into the night, 3 separate divination tools spread across his desk, a shallow silver basin of water, a set of old bone runes his mother had left him, a fine golden thread tied around one finger that was meant, in theory, to pull faintly in the direction of a person's location if the caster held their name and blood connection firmly enough in mind. The thread simply hung limp. "That's not possible," he murmured to the empty office to Fawkes, who watched from his perch with dark, knowing eyes. "Blood tracking doesn't fail, not unless the subject is dead or so heavily warded against detection that—" He stopped himself because the third possibility, the one crawling at the edge of his thoughts, was worse than either of the first two. Not dead. Not hidden by magic he could recognize. Simply, beyond the reach of magic itself, in some way he had never before encountered. He tried the water basin next, focusing every ounce of his considerable will on the image of a small dark-haired boy with his mother's eyes, and the water rippled briefly, showing him nothing but static, gray and formless, like trying to view a picture through a television tuned between channels. And then, for the barest fraction of a second, an image resolved. A wide gray room. A boy standing in the center of it, arms raised, and around him, crackling and vast, an aura of raw energy unlike anything Dumbledore had ever seen a human being produce, gold and electric blue intertwined, and behind a sheet of glass, watching, the unmistakable shape of a man in a wheelchair. The vision snapped shut as abruptly as it had opened, and Dumbledore sat back in his chair, his hands trembling very slightly, an old, familiar chill settling into his bones that he associated, uncomfortably, with the earliest days of the last war. "Fawkes," he said quietly, "I think we need to speak to someone at MACUSA. And I think, before that, I need to speak with someone who might know precisely what kind of power that was." It took Dumbledore 11 days to find his answer, and the answer arrived in the unlikely shape of a retired squib researcher living in upstate New York, a woman named Agatha Harkness, no relation to anything mystical, simply a woman with a lifetime's academic obsession, with the intersection of magic and the strange non-magical mutations that had, in recent decades, begun appearing among the Muggle population with increasing frequency. "You want to know about Xavier's lot," she said, over tea in a cramped, book-crowded study that smelled of old parchment and cat hair, eyeing Dumbledore with the particular wariness of someone who'd spent a lifetime being dismissed by both the magical and Muggle worlds, and had grown tired of being underestimated by either. "Not many wizards bother asking. Most of us pretend mutants don't exist at all. Tidier that way, keeps the two kinds of freak in separate boxes." She said the word with an edge that made clear she didn't think much of the label. "But I've studied it for 30 years. There's a school, upstate, runs by a telepath named Charles Xavier, teaches children who manifest what the Muggles call an X gene, powers that look a great deal like magic to anyone who doesn't know better, except they come from blood and biology rather than wand and will. And you believe my missing student might be there. I believe, Agatha said carefully, that if a wizarding child ever did carry a latent X gene alongside his magic, which, mind you, no wizard has ever properly studied, because we don't look, then a night of sufficiently violent trauma could theoretically trigger both at once. And I believe that Xavier's machine, this Cerebro of his, can feel mutant signatures across the whole world the instant they manifest. If your boy lit up bright enough to overload your ministry's ward stations, Albus, I promise you Xavier felt it too. And I promise you he'd have gone and gotten the child himself, faster than any of your lot could manage, because that man does not sit on his hands when a child is suffering. Dumbledore sat with that for a long moment, his tea cooling untouched in front of him, turning over 10 years of certainty about the shape of Harry Potter's life and finding it, suddenly, catastrophically insufficient. I need to speak with him, Dumbledore said finally. Xavier. Then I'll tell you where to find him, Agatha said. But I'll give you one piece of advice for free, Albus, since you've always struck me as a man who thinks 2 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. Xavier doesn't respond well to men who think they own children by right of prophecy or blood or old debts. If that boy's happy where he's landed, and if what triggered that gene was even half as bad as I suspect, you do well to walk in there asking, not demanding. The letter arrived at Xavier's mansion on a bright, ordinary Saturday morning, delivered not by post but by a very large, very confused-looking barn owl that circled the grounds twice before Aurora, watching from an upstairs window, went out to retrieve it, more out of curious astonishment than anything else. Professor Xavier, it read, in a fine, old-fashioned hand, I write to you regarding a child currently in your care, one Harry James Potter, whom I have reason to believe manifested a very significant magical event on the night of the 11th of July, and who I understand may also carry a genetic mutation of the sort your institution specializes in nurturing. I do not write to demand his return. I write instead to ask for the opportunity to meet with him, and with you, so that he might understand the full truth of his heritage and be permitted to make an informed choice about his future, a choice I confess I should have offered him from the beginning had circumstances allowed. I would be grateful for the chance to speak plainly, at your convenience, at whatever time and place puts you and the boy most at ease. Albus Dumbledore. Xavier read the letter twice at his desk, his expression unreadable, and then set it down and reached, gently, for Harry's mind across the mansion's halls, not to intrude, simply to send the smallest ripple of a request. Harry, would you come to my office, please? Something's arrived that I think you should see for yourself. Harry arrived 5 minutes later, still in his training clothes, hair damp with sweat from a morning session with Kurt that had involved considerably more falling over than either of them wanted to admit to Logan, and read the letter slowly, twice, his face going through a complicated sequence of expressions Xavier watched with careful, patient attention. There's a whole other world, Harry said finally, quietly, not quite a question. Magic, a real, proper world of it, not just things happening to me. So it would seem, Xavier said. I confess I've had my own suspicions since the day I felt what surrounded you in that training exercise. What you did, the golden pull, as Hank's been calling it, that was not a mutant power in the way I understand mutation. I believe it may be something considerably older, something this letter suggests has a name and a history, and apparently an entire hidden society built around it. Harry set the letter down, his hands, Xavier noticed, entirely steady. Do you think I should meet him? I think, Xavier said carefully, that you deserve every piece of the truth about who you are and where you came from, and that no one, not this man, not myself, not anyone else who claims some stake in your future, has the right to withhold that truth from you simply because it's inconvenient to their own plans. Whether you choose to act on that truth once you have it is entirely, completely your decision. I want to be very clear about that, Harry. This is your choice to make. Not mine. Not his. Harry looked at the letter for a long moment, and then up at Xavier, and something steady and certain settled behind his green eyes, not fear, not the flinching wariness that had defined so much of his first weeks in this house, but something that looked, for the first time, genuinely like resolve. "Then let's meet him," Harry said. "But I want everyone there. Oraro, Logan, Jean, I don't want to be alone in a room with someone who's apparently been keeping secrets about me since before I could talk." "Done," Xavier said, and something in his voice, pride, quiet and unmistakable, made Harry's chest ache in the good way. "You won't be alone in that room, Harry. Not for 1 second. Albus Dumbledore arrived at the gates of Xavier's mansion 3 days later, on foot, having apparated to the nearest wooded stretch a half-mile down the road out of some old, ingrained habit of caution about approaching unfamiliar wards directly. He wore Muggle clothing for the occasion, a slightly ill-fitting tweed suit that made him look, Oraro would later observe dryly, like a substitute geography teacher, and carried nothing but a plain wooden walking stick, which several of the mansion's more perceptive students clocked immediately as something considerably more than decorative. He was shown into Xavier's study by Logan, who made absolutely no effort to hide his suspicion, standing just inside the door with his arms crossed, and his eyes tracking Dumbledore's every movement with the particular intensity of a man who had already decided on principle not to trust anyone claiming rightful ownership of a child he'd personally carried out of danger. "Mr. Dumbledore," Xavier said, extending a hand from behind his desk. "Thank you for writing ahead, rather than simply arriving unannounced. I find that courtesy tends to set a better tone for difficult conversations." "I imagine it does," Dumbledore said, settling into the offered chair with the easy, unhurried grace of a man who had spent decades in rooms considerably more hostile than this one. His pale blue eyes moved once around the room, to Logan by the door, to Oraro standing near the window, to Jean seated slightly behind Xavier's desk with an expression of calm, watchful focus, and then, finally, to the boy sitting quietly in the chair beside Xavier, dark-haired, green-eyed, and utterly unlike the frightened, malnourished child Dumbledore had half expected based on Hagrid's account of the Dursley household. "Harry," Dumbledore said, and his voice for just a moment wavered with something that looked almost like genuine emotion. "You look remarkably like your father, and your mother's eyes, I'd know them anywhere." "You knew my parents," Harry said. "It wasn't quite a question. I did. Your father was a student of mine many years ago at a school called Hogwarts, a school for witches and wizards, which I understand may sound like something out of a children's story, though I promise you it is entirely real. Your mother was one of the brightest students I ever had the privilege of teaching. They were both extraordinary people, Harry, and they loved you very much, and they died protecting you from a very dangerous man who wanted you dead." Harry sat with that for a long moment, his hands folded very still in his lap, and Xavier, watching carefully, felt no flicker of panic or grief rise in the boy's mind loud enough to register, only a quiet, guarded attentiveness, the practiced stillness of a child who had learned long ago not to react visibly to information until he decided what to do with it. "My aunt told me they died in a car crash," Harry said. "Your aunt," Dumbledore said, with something careful and diplomatic in his tone, "was given a false account by wizards who believed it kinder at the time than the truth. I won't pretend that decision hasn't weighed on me. I made it myself 11 years ago, believing I was protecting you from a world that would have made a spectacle of your grief before you were even old enough to walk. I see now that decision came at a cost I did not fully anticipate." "What cost?" Harry asked, and there was an edge in his voice now, quiet but unmistakable. Dumbledore met his eyes steadily. "I placed you with your mother's sister, believing her home would be protected by an ancient magic tied to blood, a ward so powerful that no dark wizard, however skilled, could touch you within those walls. I did not know, and I confess I did not think to ask, whether the people inside those walls might themselves become the danger I was trying to protect you from. For that, Harry, I am more sorry than I know how to properly express." The room was silent for a long moment. Logan's arms were still crossed, his expression unreadable, but something in the set of his shoulders had shifted slightly. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something less openly hostile. "So there's a whole world," Harry said finally, steering the conversation the way Xavier had watched him steer conversations before, deliberate, controlled, refusing to let anyone else dictate its emotional temperature. "Magic, wands, a school. An entire world," Dumbledore confirmed. "Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry has educated young witches and wizards for over 1,000 years. You have a place there, Harry, should you wish to take it, has had, since the day you were born, in fact. A letter was meant to reach you on your 11th birthday, 3 days after the night you left your aunt's house. What if I don't want it?" Dumbledore's expression flickered, very briefly, with something that might have been surprise, or might have been the careful concealment of a deeper unease. "That is, of course, your choice to make. But I would ask you to consider, Harry, that the world you come from is your birthright in a way few other things in your life are. There is history there, community, an entire culture built by people like you, going back centuries. And there is also," he hesitated, and Xavier, watching closely, caught the exact moment Dumbledore chose to reveal a card he had clearly been holding back. "There is also a prophecy," Dumbledore said finally, quietly, "made before your birth, concerning a child with the power to defeat the darkest wizard our world has seen in a century, a man named Voldemort, who murdered your parents and marked you, that very night, with the scar you carry on your forehead. He did not die that night, Harry, though the wizarding world believes he did. I have believed for some years that he survives still, diminished, waiting. And I believe the prophecy names you as the only person capable of ending him for good." The silence that followed was total. Logan's jaw had gone tight enough to show muscle. Aurora's expression had shifted from watchful to something considerably colder. Jean, Xavier noticed, had gone very still, her attention sharpening in the particular way that meant she was listening to something beneath the words as much as the words themselves. Harry, for his part, did not flinch, did not gasp, did not do any of the things Dumbledore might reasonably have expected from a child, just informed he was the prophesied destroyer of a Dark Lord. He simply looked at Dumbledore for a long moment, his green eyes very steady, and said, in a voice that carried none of the fear the old man had perhaps braced himself for, "So the reason you want me at your school isn't really about my birthright at all. It's because there's a prophecy that says I'm supposed to fight somebody, and you need me there so I can do it." Dumbledore's mouth opened and closed, and Xavier watched the old wizard search, visibly, for a way to answer that softened the truth of it, and found, apparently, that there wasn't one. "That is," Dumbledore admitted slowly, "not an inaccurate way of putting it. Though I would say the world needs you there, Harry, not merely myself." "Right," Harry said, and there was no anger in his voice, which somehow made it land harder than fury would have, just a flat, clear-eyed understanding that had clearly cost him nothing to arrive at, because some part of him had already quietly expected exactly this. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When my aunt used to lock me in a cupboard and my uncle used to hit me, did any of that magic you put on the house stop him? Even once?" The question hung in the air, plain and unadorned, and Dumbledore's face went, very slowly, pale. "No," he said finally, quietly. "The wards were never designed to prevent harm from within the household, only to keep certain dangers from without." "I did not know." "You didn't ask," Harry said. "Not cruel, just factual. You put a magic wall around a house to keep a dark wizard out, and you never once checked what was actually happening to the kid inside it. And now you're telling me there's a whole world I belong to, and a prophecy that says I'm the only one who can beat this Voldemort person, and you want me to come learn magic at your school so I can grow up and do exactly that." "I understand how that must sound," Dumbledore said, and for the first time in the conversation his composure had genuinely cracked. "Harry, I promise you my intentions." "I believe your intentions were good," Harry said, cutting him off, not unkindly, but with a firmness that made Logan, by the door, exchange a brief, startled glance with Aurora. "I actually do. I don't think you're a bad person, sir, but good intentions put me in a cupboard for 10 years, and good intentions didn't check on me once in all that time. And now good intentions want me to come fight a war I've never heard of, in a world I've never seen, because of something that was decided about me before I was even born." He paused and looked briefly at Xavier, at Logan, at Aurora, at Jean, at the 4 people in the room who had, in the space of a single month, done more to make him feel like a person rather than a problem than his entire blood family had managed in a decade. "I want to learn about the magic side," Harry said finally, turning back to Dumbledore. "I do. It's part of who I am, and I don't want to pretend it isn't. But I'm not moving into your world, sir. I'm not leaving this house, and I'm not going to spend the next 7 years being groomed to fight somebody else's war just because some prophecy decided that was my job before I could even talk. If I decide, someday, that I want to fight Voldemort, that'll be because I chose it, not because it was written down for me." Dumbledore sat very still for a long moment, and something moved across his face that was, Xavier thought, watching closely, a rare and genuine thing, not the careful diplomatic mask the old wizard had clearly worn into this room, but something closer to real, unguarded respect, tangled up with a grief that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the slow, painful recognition of just how much damage a decade of good intentions had actually caused. "You sound," Dumbledore said finally, quietly, "remarkably like your mother. She had exactly that same habit of seeing straight through people's excuses to the truth underneath them. It was, I confess, both her greatest gift and the thing that most often got her into trouble." A pause. "I won't pretend I'm not disappointed, Harry. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that you would come to Hogwarts and find there the community and belonging I believed you were owed. But I will not force that choice on you. I've done enough forcing of choices in your life already, it seems, without ever once asking whether they were mine to make. Can I still learn?" Harry asked, and for the first time in the conversation, something younger and more uncertain crept into his voice. "The magic. I don't want to just not know. It's part of me. I can arrange for a tutor," Dumbledore said slowly, thinking it through even as he spoke. "There are ways to teach the fundamentals outside Hogwarts's walls, unconventional, certainly, and it will raise questions among certain corners of the ministry that I would rather avoid answering directly, but not impossible, if Professor Xavier is amenable to it." "I am," Xavier said, "provided the tutor understands they are a guest in this house, teaching a subject and nothing more. Harry's education and his safety remain under this roof's protection. I trust that's acceptable." "Entirely," Dumbledore said, and there was something almost like relief in his voice, relief, Xavier suspected, at being given any foothold at all in Harry's life rather than being shut out completely, a mercy the old wizard seemed to recognize he had done very little to earn. They talked for another hour after that, logistics mostly, the practical shape of what a wizarding education outside Hogwarts might look like. Careful, diplomatic ground that both men navigated with the particular caution of people who understood exactly how fragile the peace they'd just built actually was. But underneath the practical conversation, something had shifted permanently in the room, and everyone present knew it. Harry Potter had, for the first time in his entire life, been handed a decision that genuinely belonged to him, with real consequences attached to either choice, and he had made it clearly, calmly, without flinching, in a room full of adults twice and 3 times his age. Dumbledore left an hour before sunset, walking back down the long gravel drive toward the woods with his walking stick, tapping a slow, thoughtful rhythm against the ground, and Xavier watched him go from the study window with an expression that mingled genuine sympathy with something more guarded. "He's not our enemy," Xavier said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "But he is a man who has spent decades believing the ends he serves justify almost any means, and I don't think today has fully cured him of that belief. We'll need to watch that world carefully going forward, not with hostility, but carefully." "Kid handled it better than most adults I know would have," Logan said, and there was real pride in his voice, rough and unpolished. "Didn't flinch once. Didn't back down. Just laid it all out plain and made the guy own it. He gets that from somewhere," Aurora said, with the faintest smile, glancing toward the door where Harry had gone a few minutes earlier, apparently in search of Kitty and a promised rematch at cards. "I wonder where." It was 2 nights later, on a warm, still evening with the crickets loud outside his window, that Harry woke to find someone standing at the foot of his bed who had absolutely no business being there. He didn't scream. 10 years of learning to wake silently, to assess danger before reacting, kicked in instantly, and he sat up slowly, every muscle coiled, feeling the familiar electric hum already gathering under his skin, ready. The man standing at the foot of his bed didn't move, didn't reach for anything, simply stood with his hands folded behind his back, watching Harry with an expression of calm, patient interest. An older man, silver-haired, dressed in a dark, severe coat that seemed to belong to a different decade entirely, his eyes a pale, watchful gray. "How did you get in here?" Harry asked, low and steady though his heart was hammering. "This place has alarms, sensors." "There's no way you just meddle, Mr. Potter," the man said in a voice that carried an old, precise accent, faintly European, faintly amused. "This mansion is riddled with it, wiring, pipes, the frames of every door and window. To someone who can feel metal the way you feel your own heartbeat, walls are rather more of a suggestion than a barrier." He inclined his head slightly. "My name is Eric Laneshare. Some call me Magneto, though I've never much cared for the theatrics of the name. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because I've heard a great deal about you in recent weeks, and I wanted to see for myself whether the stories were true." Harry didn't relax, not entirely, but the electricity under his skin settled slightly, watchful rather than primed to strike. "What stories?" That Xavier's machine detected a child whose power registered stronger than anything in 3 decades of scanning. That the boy in question grew up locked in a cupboard by people who despised him for what he was, and awoke one night with enough force to level a house, and chose, mind you, not merely stumbled into mercy instead of vengeance against the man who'd beaten him for a decade. Eric's gray eyes studied him with something that wasn't quite approval, wasn't quite calculation, but sat somewhere thoughtfully between the two. "That's rare, Mr. Potter. Rarer than the power itself, in my experience. Most people, given a fraction of what you carry, use it exactly the way it was used against them, sooner or later. You didn't." "What do you want?" Harry asked. "I want to offer you a prospective Xavier, for all his considerable virtues, is constitutionally incapable of offering you honestly," Eric said. "Charles believes, with a faith I sometimes envy and sometimes pity, that mutants and ordinary humans can build a peaceful future together, if we simply demonstrate our goodness clearly enough, patiently enough, for long enough. I have watched that hope cost good people their lives, more than once, in more countries than I care to list. I believe, instead, that power such as yours was not given to you so that you could beg humanity's permission to exist safely. I believe it was given to you so that you would never again have to. I'm not going to hurt anyone just because I can, Harry said, flat, immediate. I'm not asking you to, Eric said, unhurried, entirely unoffended by the sharpness of the response. I'm asking you to remember when the day comes, and it will come, Mr. Potter, it always does, whether from your world of wands or Charles's world of frightened humans with guns, that you never need to be afraid of anyone who tries to control you. Not a ministry, not a prophecy, not a headmaster with a kind face and old debts he expects you to repay. You have more power in you than nearly anyone alive in either of your two worlds, and the only thing more dangerous than that power is you forgetting it belongs entirely to yourself. He stepped back from the bed, toward the window, unhurried, and paused there with one hand resting against the frame. I don't expect you to trust me tonight, Eric said. I'd think less of you if you did. Trust that arrives that quickly is rarely worth much. But when you're older, and you've seen both your worlds show you their true faces, and they will, sooner than you'd like, remember that there was a man who came to your window in the middle of the night, and asked nothing of you except that you never forget your own strength. That's all. Good night, Mr. Potter. The window unlatched itself with a soft click, though Harry hadn't seen him touch it, and Eric Laneshare stepped out onto the ledge and was gone into the dark before Harry had even fully decided whether to call for help. He sat in his bed for a long time afterward, staring at the empty window, the electricity slowly settling back beneath his skin, and thought about the strange, careful weight of everything the man had said. Not quite a threat, not quite a recruitment, something stranger and more patient than either, planted deliberately like a seed and left to grow entirely on its own. In the morning, he told Xavier everything, word for word, watching the older man's face go carefully, deliberately neutral in the particular way Harry had already learned meant Xavier was working very hard not to show how alarmed he actually was. He's not wrong about everything, Harry said, when Xavier had gone quiet for a long moment processing. About the power being mine, about not letting anyone control me because of what I can do. He paused, but I don't think that means what he wants it to mean. I don't think being strong means I have to be scared of people or make people scared of me. Xavier looked at him for a long moment, and something in his pale eyes eased, very slightly, with something that looked almost like relief. No, he said quietly, it doesn't. And I think, Harry, that the fact you can hear a man like Eric make his case, and still land exactly where you just landed, tells me a great deal more about who you're going to become than anything Cerebro ever measured. A small, warm smile. Now, eat your breakfast. Logan tells me you owe him a rematch, and something about a promise involving considerably fewer flat-on-your-back moments than last time. Harry laughed, a real laugh, easy and unguarded, the kind that still sometimes surprised him with how naturally it came now, and went down to breakfast, and did not, for the rest of that day, think once about cupboards or prophecies or old men with careful, patient offers standing uninvited at the foot of his bed, but far across the ocean, in a room lit by candlelight in a manor house that did not appear on any Muggle map. A different kind of attention had already begun to turn, slow and cold and deliberate, toward a scar-shaped rumor traveling through the wizarding underworld. A rumor that the boy who lived was not merely alive, but had grown into something the old prophecy had never accounted for, something powerful enough to overload ministry wards and vanish from the world entirely. Hidden now behind walls that no wizard alive seemed able to breach. Chapter 4. The night the wards fell, the boy's name was Danny Chen. He was 9 years old, and he could make light. Not electricity, not the crackling storm light that lived under Harry's skin. Soft light, warm light. The kind that spilled out of his palms in slow, gentle waves whenever he laughed too hard or got too excited, so that half the time you could tell exactly how Danny was feeling just by the color of the room around him. He'd arrived at the mansion 2 weeks after Harry, small and shy, and desperately homesick for a family in San Francisco who hadn't understood what was happening to their son, and had, out of fear more than cruelty, asked Xavier to take him before anyone got hurt. Harry found him crying in the library on his 3rd night, curled into the window seat with the curtains pulled half shut, the little bit of light leaking out from between his fingers turning the whole alcove a soft, sad blue. "You'll get in trouble," Danny said, when Harry sat down across from him without asking permission. "I'm not supposed to. It just happens when I'm sad. I can't stop it." "Nobody's going to get you in trouble here," Harry said, and meant it with the particular authority of someone who'd spent 3 months learning exactly how true that was. "I broke every light bulb in my old house the first time this happened to me. Blew up half a hallway. Nobody yelled at me for it. Well, Logan yelled a bit, but that was because I tried it again without telling anybody first." Danny had laughed, a small, surprised laugh, the light around him flickering brighter for a second before settling into something warmer, less sad. And from that night on, he trailed after Harry with the devoted, uncomplicated loyalty younger kids sometimes attached to older ones. And Harry, who had never once in his life had anyone look up to him for anything, found he genuinely didn't mind it. By late September, Danny had gotten good enough with his gift that he could hold a steady glow for whole minutes without flickering, could shape the light into rough, wobbling forms if he concentrated hard enough. A bird once, a dog another time, each one dissolving after a few seconds into scattered sparks that drifted down like snow. He liked showing Harry these little shapes best of anyone, and Harry, in turn, had taken to sitting with him most evenings after dinner, on the back terrace overlooking the lake, letting Danny practice his light shapes against the darkening sky, while Harry did his own quieter practice beside him, small, controlled sparks of blue-white electricity dancing between his fingers. Careful, deliberate, nothing like the chaotic first discharge that had blown apart Vernon Dursley's hallway back in July. "Do you think I'll ever be as strong as you?" Danny asked one evening in late September, watching Harry's electricity crawl in slow, lazy spirals up his forearm. "I think you'll be exactly as strong as you're supposed to be," Harry said, which was something Aurora had told him once, and which he'd liked enough to steal. "Doesn't have to look like mine to matter." He had no idea that evening, watching Danny's small shape of light, a wobbling, imperfect butterfly this time, drift up over the dark water of the lake and dissolve into stars, that he was watching something he would remember, later, with a grief sharp enough to reshape the entire rest of his childhood. 3 weeks earlier, in a manor house on the edge of a wood in Wiltshire that did not appear on any map, Lucius Malfoy knelt on cold stone before a presence that had no proper body anymore. Only a fading, malevolent will clinging to whatever host would tolerate it. Currently residing, thin, wraith-like, barely more substantial than smoke, in the shadowed corner of a room lit only by a single dying candle. "You are certain of this," the voice said, dry and cold, more hiss than speech, seeping out of the shadows rather than any visible mouth. "Certain the boy survives and survives strengthened." The signal that overloaded 3 ministry ward stations in a single night was not a fluke, my lord, Malfoy said, his voice carefully level, the voice of a man who had learned over many years precisely how much fear to show his master and precisely how much to hide. Bones's own analysts called it a magical discharge inconsistent with human capability. And there is more. Rookwood has a contact inside the Department of Mysteries, a researcher who has, for years, quietly studied the intersection of magic and the Muggle phenomenon they call mutation. She believes the boy may carry both magic and something else besides, something that does not answer to wands or wards or any spell we currently possess. The shadow in the corner was silent for a long moment, and when it spoke again, the cold hiss had sharpened into something closer to genuine alarm, an emotion Malfoy had rarely heard from his master in 15 years of service. The connection, the voice said, almost to itself. The scar links us, Lucius. It has since the night I marked him. A thread between his mind and mine, thin as spider silk, but a thread nonetheless. If that boy grows strong enough, if whatever sleeps in his blood wakes fully, that thread could become a door through which he might one day, without even understanding what he was doing, reach into whatever remains of me and tear it apart. A pause, and the candle flame guttered as though something unseen had drawn close to it. I will not permit that, not while I remain this weak, not while I have not yet found a way back to a body of my own. What would you have us do, my lord? Find him, the voice said. Find where he is being kept and bring him to me, alive, if it can be managed cleanly, so that I might study this thread myself and decide what must be done. Dead, if it cannot. I care considerably less for the boy's survival than I do for the survival of what remains of myself. Another pause, longer this time. And Lucius, do not underestimate whoever is sheltering him. Anyone capable of overloading ministry wards without a single alarm sounding is not merely some kindly Muggle family. This is a power we do not yet understand, hiding a boy we understand even less. Move carefully, move quietly, and bring Grey back, if the boy's guardians prove resistant. I want something in our ranks capable of matching whatever strength they've built around him. It took Malfoy's people 3 weeks to trace the rumor to its source. 3 weeks of careful, deniable inquiries through the Goblin information networks, through a bribed clerk in the International Confederation of Wizards Records office, through a frightened, cornered squib researcher named Agatha Harkness, who gave up considerably more than she meant to under the particular persuasive pressure of a wand pressed against her throat and a promise, carefully worded. That cooperation would end the conversation faster than resistance would. By the 3rd week of September, Lucius Malfoy stood at the edge of a wooded property line in Westchester County, New York. Looking out at a distant mansion through a pair of Muggle field glasses he found faintly ridiculous to be holding, and felt, for the first time in this entire operation, a genuine flicker of unease. "The wards on that place aren't ours," said Antonin Dolohov beside him, his wand already drawn, his scarred face set in its usual expression of contemptuous readiness. "Feel wrong, not warm like our kind, metallic, electric, something's protecting that house that isn't magic at all." "Whatever it is," Malfoy said, lowering the field glasses, "our orders remain the same. We move at night. We move fast. We take the boy or we kill him and we're gone before whatever lives in that house even finishes waking up." He glanced sideways at the hulking, unkempt shape of Fenrir Greyback, who was grinning in the darkness with an eagerness that made even Malfoy's skin crawl slightly. "You understand your part in this, Greyback." "Break in loud," Greyback said, relish thick in his voice. "Draw out whatever guards that place. Give the boy nowhere quiet to hide in." His grin widened, showing too many teeth. "Been a long time since I had a proper hunt, Lucius. Long time." Harry woke at 3 in the morning to a sound that had no business existing at Xavier's mansion. A low, grinding creak, metal against metal, coming from somewhere down near the front gates, followed a half-second later by a silent, spreading pressure against the edges of his awareness that felt disturbingly like the moment before a held breath gives out. He was out of bed and pulling on shoes before he'd fully processed why. Some old, deep instinct from 10 years of learning to read danger, before it arrived screaming at him that something was catastrophically wrong. He reached the hallway just as the mansion's alarm system tore through the silence. Not a gentle chime, but a full, blaring klaxon, red emergency lighting flooding every corridor, and doors up and down the hall banging open as students stumbled out in various states of sleep-crumpled panic. "Harry," Kitty's voice, sharp with fear from further down the hall. "Something's coming through the front gate. Scott says it's not on any of the sensors right, like it's not even there half the time." "Apparition," Harry said, the word arriving in his mouth from 3 months of secret midnight tutoring sessions with a soft-spoken witch named Daedalus Diggle, sent quietly by Dumbledore to teach him the fundamentals no one else in this house could. "Wizards, it has to be." He didn't have time to feel afraid before Logan's voice cut through the corridor, sharp and utterly commanding, all traces of his usual easy gruffness gone. "Everybody under 16, basement shelter now, no arguing." "Older students, staging point in the East Hall, professor's orders, move." Harry moved toward the East Hall instead of the basement, and nobody stopped him. 3 months of danger room evaluations had already, quietly, moved him out of the protect at all costs category and into something closer to combatant. A shift he'd noticed happening without anyone ever formally announcing it. Xavier met them in the East Hall, already in his chair, his face set in a grim, focused calm that Harry had never seen on him before. "There are 11 distinct hostile presences on the grounds," Xavier said, his voice tight with the effort of maintaining a mental scan across the whole property, while simultaneously herding 200 sleeping students toward shelter. "Human, but not. There's something about their minds. Walls I can't easily read past, trained resistance of some kind. I believe these are wizards, Harry. I believe they've come for you." "Then they can have me answer them themselves," Harry said, and something in the flat certainty of his own voice surprised him even as he said it. No fear in it at all, only a cold, clear readiness he hadn't fully known he possessed until this exact moment. Outside, the front gates tore open with a groan of shredding metal, and the first curse, a burst of sickly green light that Harry's newly acquired lessons identified, with a jolt of real dread, as something considerably worse than a stunning spell, lanced across the front lawn and blew apart a decorative stone urn into powder. "That's the killing curse," Harry said, quiet and cold. "That's an actual killing curse. They just used it on a plant pot. Then we don't give them a second chance to aim at anything that breathes," Aurora said, already moving past him toward the front doors, her white hair beginning to lift and crackle with static as the sky outside darkened unnaturally fast, storm clouds boiling in from nowhere in the space of seconds. The battle that followed did not look anything like the careful, controlled danger room simulations Harry had spent 3 months mastering. It was loud and fast, and genuinely terrifying in a way no simulation had ever bothered to replicate. And Harry's first real lesson of the night was that fear, when it actually mattered, didn't feel anything like the caution he'd learned to respect in training. It felt like ice water dropped straight into his chest, cold and immediate, and he had exactly 1 heartbeat to decide whether it was going to make him useless or make him dangerous. He chose dangerous. The first Death Eater through the shattered gate, a heavy-set man Harry would later learn was called Travers, got exactly 1 spell off before a bolt of blue-white electricity, faster than any wand flick, caught him square in the chest and sent him flying backward into the stone gatepost hard enough to crack the mortar. He didn't get up. "Boys fast," someone snarled from further down the lawn, and Harry turned to find a huge, wolfish man advancing across the grass with a grin that showed too many teeth, moving in a low, predatory crouch that had nothing to do with wands at all. "Fast's good. Fast makes it more fun." "Harry, get back," Logan's voice sharp from somewhere to his left, and then the man was there between them, claws already extended, his own low growl matching Greyback's, animal recognizing animal. "This one's mine, kid. Watch your flanks, count more of 'em coming up from the tree line." Harry didn't wait to watch the two of them collide. The sound of it, claws against claws, was enough to make his teeth ache even from a distance, because Xavier's warning had been right on schedule. 3 more shapes were emerging from the dark tree line at the edge of the property, wands already raised, and Harry felt the electricity surge through his arms before he'd even consciously decided to move. He'd never fought like this before. Not a simulation, not a controlled exercise. Real spells cutting through the dark toward people he actually cared about, and something in him that had been quiet and careful for 3 months of training finally, fully let go. The barrier came up around him instinctively, the same crackling blue-white shield that had first appeared unbidden in the danger room, except this time it didn't just deflect. It arced, lightning leaping outward from the shield's edge toward the 3 advancing wizards, and one of them screamed as the bolt caught his wand arm and sent the wood flying from his scorched fingers. "He's not stunning us," one of the remaining 2 shouted, voice cracking with real fear now. "That's not a stunner, that's Merlin's beard, Dolohov, that's lethal." "Then don't let him hit you," Dolohov snarled back, and the curse he sent screaming toward Harry was a deep, ugly purple that Harry, with the cold clarity of adrenaline sharpening every sense he had, recognized from a chapter in Diggle's careful, illicit lesson book on curses to avoid at all costs. Harry didn't try to block it with the shield. Something told him, in the half-second he had to decide, that the shield wouldn't stop it cleanly. Instead he dropped low and rolled, a piece of Logan's morning drilling paying off in a way Harry had never expected combat magic to require, and the curse tore a smoking, blackened gouge through the lawn where he'd been standing a half-second earlier. He came up already reaching for the second thing, the older thing, the golden pull that had first surfaced weeks ago and that Hank still hadn't managed to fully explain. And this time, instead of letting it simply gather and fade, Harry directed it, reached out toward Dolohov's wand hand with a sudden, violent yank of gravity that Hank's notes would later, with considerable understatement, describe as an apparent limited manipulation of localized attractive force, and watched the man's wand tear itself free of his grip and go skittering across the grass, 20 feet away, entirely beyond reach. Dolohov stared at his own empty hand for a full second, disbelieving, and in that second, Harry closed the distance and hit him, not with magic, not with electricity, but with the same right hook Logan had spent 3 weeks drilling into muscle memory, timed off the hips exactly the way he'd been taught, and the Death Eater went down like a felled tree. Behind him, the storm Aurora had summoned broke apart across the front lawn in a controlled fury, lightning strikes precise enough to be surgical rather than chaotic, driving back 2 more attackers who tried to flank around the eastern hedge line. Jean's telekinesis wrenched a fallen tree branch across another Death Eater's path exactly as he tried to apparate, disrupting his concentration badly enough that the spell fizzled entirely, and Kurt appeared and vanished in flickering bursts of brimstone-scented smoke, herding 2 more attackers into a confused, disoriented knot near the fountain that Scott's optic blasts made short, sharp work of a moment later. For a few wild, adrenaline-blurred minutes, it genuinely looked like it might be enough, like 11 trained, dangerous wizards had badly underestimated exactly what kind of house they'd broken into. Then Malfoy, watching from the shadow of the tree line, decided the mission had already failed on its quiet terms, and gave the order that turned the whole night into something considerably worse. "Burn it," he snarled, to the 2 Death Eaters still standing beside him. "If we can't take the boy clean, we take him from the wreckage. Fire the east wing, draw the little ones out of whatever hole they've hidden in." The basement shelter had been built to withstand a great many things: reinforced walls, its own independent air supply, a door that could survive a small explosion. It had not, in its original design, been meant to withstand deliberate, targeted fire magic aimed directly at the ventilation shaft feeding it. And when the first curse tore through that shaft in a roaring column of unnatural orange flame, the younger students sheltering below scattered in genuine panic, coughing on smoke that had no business spreading that fast through a sealed space. Danny Chen, 9 years old, small and frightened and desperately trying to remember everything Harry had ever told him about not being ashamed of what came out of him when he was scared, did the only thing he could think to do. He reached for the light, the way Harry had taught him, and pushed it outward as hard and as bright as he possibly could, carving a path through the smoke for the smaller kids around him to see by. Guiding 3 terrified 6-year-olds toward the shelter's secondary exit, while flame licked closer along the ceiling above them. He got all 3 of them out. He was reaching back for a 4th, a little girl named Alina who'd frozen entirely, too terrified to move, when a section of scorched, weakened ceiling finally gave way above him. Harry felt it before he understood what it meant, a sudden, sickening lurch in Xavier's telepathic connection to the whole property, a wrongness so sharp and so absolute that the older man's psychic voice actually cracked as it tore through every mind on the grounds at once. East Wing, basement shelter, now Harry ran. He didn't remember deciding to, didn't remember the distance covering itself. Only the sudden, roaring heat of the East Wing corridor and Logan already ahead of him, tearing through a collapsed section of wall with his bare claws, hauling debris aside with a speed and a fury that had nothing performative left in it at all. They found Alina first, coughing, terrified but alive, curled in the small pocket of clear air Danny's last, desperate push of light had carved out and held even as the ceiling came down. They found Danny a moment later, and Harry knew, with a cold, immediate certainty that had nothing to do with hope, that it was already too late. He was small under the fallen beam, smaller than he'd ever looked awake, and the soft glow that had always surrounded him when he was scared or excited or happy was already fading, flickering the way a candle does in its last few seconds before the wick simply runs out of anything left to burn. "No," Harry said, and it didn't sound like his own voice at all, cracked open and raw, dropping to his knees in the wreckage and rubble, hands hovering uselessly because there was nowhere safe to touch, no injury small enough to fix with anything he knew how to do. "No, come on, Danny, come on." Danny's eyes fluttered, found Harry's face in the smoke and the dying orange light, and for one terrible, precious second, the ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Got the little ones out," he whispered, so quiet Harry had to lean in close to catch it at all. "Did I do good?" "You did so good," Harry said, and his voice broke completely on the last word, tears he hadn't cried in years, not since he was 7, not since he decided crying didn't do anything except make the walls feel closer, spilling freely down his soot-streaked face. "You did everything right, Danny, everything, I promise." The light around Danny's small hands flickered once more, faint and gold, one last soft pulse, like a held breath finally, gently released. And then it went out. Harry did not remember afterward exactly what happened in the next 60 seconds. He remembered kneeling in the wreckage with Danny's small, still body in his arms. He remembered Logan's hand closing hard on his shoulder, saying something he couldn't hear over the roaring in his own ears. He remembered the smell of smoke and blood and burned stone. And then he remembered standing. He remembered the electricity that had, for 3 months, felt like a warm hum under his skin, like a friendly, familiar thing that answered to his call and settled quietly when he was done with it, suddenly feeling like something else entirely, something vast and furious, and utterly beyond the careful control Hank had spent 3 months painstakingly helping him build. The golden pull came with it this time, unbidden, twisting together with the electricity into something Hank's notes would never be able to properly name. A single overwhelming surge that blew every remaining window in the east wing outward in a shower of shattered glass. And outside, on the front lawn, Lucius Malfoy, mid-retreat, already turning to signal his people to fall back with the mission a clear, costly failure, felt the ground beneath his feet buck and tremble, as though something enormous had just woken up directly underneath the estate. Harry walked out of the ruined East Wing corridor with his eyes practically glowing, gold and electric blue bleeding together at the edges of his irises, and every hair on the back of Malfoy's neck stood on end at the sight of him. "You killed him," Harry said, and his voice carried across the lawn without him needing to raise it at all, carried on something that wasn't quite sound, wasn't quite magic, wasn't quite anything Malfoy had a category for. He was 9 years old. He was scared, and he got 3 little kids out of that fire before the ceiling came down on him. And you killed him, because you wanted to burn me out of hiding. "We wanted you, boy," Malfoy said, though his wand hand, Harry noticed with cold, distant satisfaction, was trembling now. "Come quietly and no one else needs." He didn't finish the sentence. Harry didn't consciously decide to move. The electricity simply arrived, faster than thought. A single vast arc that tore across the front lawn and caught Malfoy's raised wand dead center. And the resulting explosion of released magical backlash threw the man 20 feet backward into the ruined gate, unconscious before he'd even finished falling. Fenrir Greyback, still locked in a snarling, bloodied grapple with Logan near the fountain, made the catastrophic mistake of glancing toward the sound of the explosion, and Logan's claws found the opening a half-second later, ending that particular fight decisively and permanently. The remaining Death Eaters, 3 of them still conscious, still standing, took one look at their fallen leader, at the boy standing in the ruined doorway with lightning still crawling visibly across his skin, at the werewolf that had come to hunt them lying still by the fountain, and made the only decision that made any tactical sense at all. They apparated, all 3 at once, in a ragged, panicked crack of displaced air and were gone. Harry stood in the sudden, ringing silence that followed. The storm Aurora had summoned finally, slowly beginning to break apart overhead, and felt the vast, furious surge inside him gradually, exhaustedly recede, not gone, never entirely gone again after tonight. He understood that much already, but settling at last back beneath his skin. He turned and walked back toward the ruined East Wing, toward the small, still shape Logan had, with a gentleness that looked almost unbearable on a man built like a weapon, already wrapped carefully in his own jacket and lifted from the rubble. "I couldn't save him," Harry said, and his voice had gone very small again, all the terrible power of a few minutes ago drained away, leaving only a grieving 11-year-old boy standing in the wreckage of the only home he'd ever truly had. "I got there and I couldn't do anything, Logan. I couldn't even." "You didn't get there too late because you weren't fast enough," Logan said, low and rough, kneeling so he was at Harry's eye level despite the weight in his arms. "You got there too late because a grown man cast fire at a room full of sleeping kids, and that's on him, kid, every single ounce of it's on him, not you. You hear me? Not you." Harry didn't answer. He simply stood there, in the smoke and the settling dust, watching the first gray light of dawn begin to creep over the shattered front gate, and understood, with a clarity that felt like the final closing of some door inside him, that the 2 worlds fighting over who he belonged to had just cost him something he was never, ever getting back. Xavier called an emergency assembly at noon. The whole school gathered in the main hall, faces pale and shocked, several of the younger students still crying quietly in twos and threes. He did not soften the truth for any of them. "We lost one of our own last night," Xavier said, his voice carrying the particular steadiness of a man holding an enormous grief very carefully in check for the sake of the children in front of him. "Daniel Chen died protecting 3 younger students from a fire that should never have reached this house. I will not pretend to you that this was anyone's fault but the people who set that fire. And I will not pretend to you that it does not hurt, more than almost anything I have felt in my life, to have failed to keep every single one of you safe under this roof." Harry sat near the back, Kitty's hand gripping his tightly enough to hurt, and listened to Xavier's voice crack very slightly on the last sentence, and felt something in his own chest that was no longer only grief, something harder and colder and considerably more dangerous, beginning, very quietly, to take root. Later that evening, alone on the back terrace where he and Danny had spent so many quiet nights practicing side by side, Harry sat with his knees drawn up to his chest, the same posture he'd once used in a cupboard under the stairs, and looked out at the dark, still lake, and made himself a promise he had no intention of ever breaking. He would learn everything Diggle could teach him about magic, and everything Xavier's school could teach him about the strange, powerful thing tangled up alongside it, and he would become strong enough, not to hide, never again to hide, but to make absolutely certain that no one, wizard or otherwise, ever again decided that a child's safety was an acceptable price to pay for their own ambitions. The Ministry would hear of the attack within days, and panic in ways that would reshape the entire wizarding world's fragile peace. Dumbledore would arrive within the week, grim and grieving in his own careful way, to offer help and apologies that would land this time on a boy who had learned, in the worst possible way, exactly how much they were worth. And somewhere in a manor house in Wiltshire, a wraith clinging to the last threads of its own survival would learn that its carefully deniable operation had failed catastrophically, and would begin, with cold and patient fury, to plan something considerably worse. But that was still to come. For now, Harry Potter sat alone on a dark terrace, grieving a 9-year-old boy who had made light out of nothing at all, and understood, with a certainty that had nothing left in it of fear, exactly what kind of person he was going to become. Chapter 5. The weight of a name. Danny Chen's funeral was small, quiet, and held on a gray Tuesday morning under a sky that Aurora, without anyone asking her to, kept perfectly, deliberately clear. No storms, no drama, just soft autumn light falling across a modest headstone at the edge of the mansion's grounds, in a corner of the estate that Xavier had, over the decades, quietly turned into a place for exactly this kind of grief. Danny's parents came from San Francisco for it, and Harry watched them stand at the graveside with expressions caught somewhere between grief and a bewildered, guilty relief that their son had at least died surrounded by people who understood what he was, rather than alone and misunderstood in a world that would have called him a monster for the same gift that had made him a hero. Harry didn't cry at the funeral. He'd done his crying already, that first terrible night, and what was left now sat lower and colder in his chest, something that had stopped feeling like grief exactly 3 days after the attack and started feeling like resolve instead. "You've been different since it happened," Jean said to him afterward, walking beside him back toward the house while the other students drifted off in twos and threes, subdued. "Not bad different, just quieter, focused almost. I don't need to read your mind to see it." "I keep thinking about what Malfoy said," Harry said. "Before I hit him, he said they wanted me. Not information about me, not a hostage, not leverage, me. Which means whoever sent him already knew exactly what I could do, and decided taking me alive was worth risking a house full of trained mutants and one telepath to try it." "Voldemort," Jean said, quiet. "Voldemort," Harry agreed. Which means this isn't over. It was never going to be over after one failed raid. He's not the kind of person who gives up because his first plan got a werewolf killed and his second-in-command knocked unconscious on my front lawn. He was quiet for a moment, watching a few fallen leaves skitter across the gravel path ahead of them. I'm done waiting for him to try again, Jean. I want to know what he's doing before he does it. I want to know where his people are, what they're planning, who else they've hurt. That's not training anymore, Jean said carefully. That's reconnaissance. That's a completely different kind of dangerous. I know, Harry said. I'm asking anyway. He asked Xavier directly that evening in the study, with Logan and Aurora present because Harry had learned, in 3 months, exactly which conversations needed witnesses to keep everyone honest. I want training that actually prepares me for what's out there, Harry said, not just danger room drills against holograms. I want to learn how Diggle's people track dark wizards, wards, tracking charms, all of it. And I want to be part of whatever comes next, when the next attack happens. Not protected from it, part of it. Xavier studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You're 11 years old, Harry. I was 11 years old when I killed a werewolf's ally with a lightning bolt and put Lucius Malfoy through a gatepost. Harry said, flat, not cruel, just factual in the way he'd learned truth often needed to be. I don't think 11 means what it used to mean for me. I'm not asking your permission to be strong, Professor. I already am. I'm asking you to help me be strong on purpose, instead of just reacting when someone I love is already dying in front of me. The room went very quiet. Logan's jaw worked once, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. Kid's not wrong, Charles. We can keep him wrapped in cotton wool and hope the next attack goes better by accident, or we can actually teach him how to fight smart instead of just fight strong. I know which one keeps more people alive. Xavier closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, something in his expression had settled into a decision. I will not send you into danger recklessly, Harry. I want that understood clearly before we go any further. But I also will not insult you by pretending you're less capable or less entitled to a say in your own safety than you clearly are. We'll build a proper training program, tactics, reconnaissance, coordination with the others, and Aurora will coordinate with Dumbledore's people quietly to see what the wizarding world already knows about Voldemort's movements that we don't. Thank you, Harry said, and meant it. Don't thank me yet, Xavier said, not unkindly. You're about to find out that being prepared for war is considerably less glamorous than the idea of it. Mostly it looks like hours of very boring study. He wasn't wrong. Over the following 6 weeks, Harry's days took on a shape that would have seemed, to any outside observer, almost mundane. Mornings with Logan on combat fundamentals, now sharpened with real tactical drilling rather than simple sparring. Afternoons with Hank refining the control of both his electrical discharge and the strange gravitational pull that still didn't have a proper name. Evenings with Diggle, who arrived twice a week now via a carefully warded portkey, teaching him wandless theory alongside actual wand work, since it had become obvious within the first month that Harry's magic, layered as it was with whatever the mutant gene had done to it, worked more naturally through will and intent than through the precise incantations most wizarding children spent years memorizing. You're doing it again, Diggle said one evening, watching Harry levitate a teacup across the study with barely a murmured word and an expression of mild concentration. Most first years spend a full term just getting Wingardium Leviosa to work reliably. You're doing wandless variants of fourth-year charms by instinct. Is that bad? It's unprecedented, Diggle said, not for the first time. Which in my professional experience tends to mean either wonderful or catastrophic, and precious little useful middle ground in between. The information gathering, meanwhile, moved along its own quieter track. Aurora's contacts inside the wizarding world, carefully cultivated, deniable, mostly built through the careful diplomacy Dumbledore had extended in an obvious, ongoing effort to rebuild whatever trust the raid had shattered, began feeding back fragments of intelligence that painted an increasingly grim picture. Death Eater activity was rising across Britain. Small, deniable disappearances. A string of unexplained fires in villages with high Muggle-born populations. And most unsettling of all, whispers of a specific location, an old, abandoned textile mill outside Leeds, long since converted by Death Eater sympathizers into something considerably darker, where captured mutants and Muggle-born wizards alike were being held, studied, and according to the most reliable of Aurora's sources, systematically drained of magic through means nobody outside Voldemort's inner circle fully understood. "They're not just hunting me anymore," Harry said, reading the latest report at the kitchen table late one November evening, his voice gone cold in a way that made Kitty, sitting across from him, go quiet. "They're experimenting, trying to figure out what makes people like us powerful so they can take it or copy it or just destroy it before it becomes a threat to them." "That's what Eric always says humans do," Kitty said quietly. "Every time. Given enough fear, enough time, they always end up trying to control or destroy what they don't understand." "Eric's not entirely wrong about that part," Harry admitted. "He's wrong about what to do about it, but he's not wrong that it keeps happening." He set the report down, jaw tight. "I want to see that mill for myself." Xavier said no the first 3 times Harry raised it. He said yes on the 4th, not because Harry's argument had changed, but because a fresh report arrived that same week confirming that at least 2 of the mill's prisoners were, according to Aurora's most trusted contact, children, a 12-year-old Muggle-born witch named Bate Turner, and a mutant boy of unknown age whose power reportedly manifested as an unusually potent form of accelerated healing. Precisely the kind of ability Voldemort's people would have every incentive to try and extract or replicate. "If we go in," Xavier said, laying out a hand-drawn schematic of the mill's layout across his desk, assembled from Aurora's sources and Hank's satellite imagery analysis. "We go in with a plan, with contingencies, with an extraction protocol that does not depend on anyone improvising in the middle of a firefight. Are we agreed?" "Agreed," Harry said, and beside him, Logan, Aurora, Jean, and Scott all nodded in turn. The 5 of them gathered around the desk in the low lamp light like something out of a war room, which, Harry reflected, was more or less exactly what this had become. Storm and Nightcrawler handle infiltration and aerial support. Xavier continued. "Jean, you're our eyes inside. If there's any telepathic ability at all among the guards, I want to know before it becomes a problem. Scott, Logan, you're breach and clear. Harry, I go in with the extraction team," Harry said before Xavier could finish, "not sit outside as backup." Xavier studied him for a long moment. "You are going in as part of a coordinated team, following an agreed plan, and if I or Logan or anyone else on that team gives you an order to fall back, you fall back without arguing. Those are my terms. I will not send you in there any other way." Harry thought about arguing. Some old, stubborn part of him still bristled at the idea of anyone else's orders governing his choices, after a lifetime of never having any choices of his own at all. But he thought, too, of Danny, of the exact cost of acting alone and unprepared, and nodded instead. "Those are fair terms," he said. "I'll follow them." The mill sat on the edge of a dead industrial estate outside Leeds, its brick walls stained black with a century of soot, half its windows boarded, the whole structure wrapped in wards that shimmered faintly to Harry's newly trained eye when the moon caught them just right. They came in just after 2 in the morning, through a gap in the wards that Diggle had helped Harry identify from studying the schematic, An old maintenance access point too small and too obscure to have been warded as thoroughly as the main entrances. Exactly the kind of oversight a careful, arrogant wizard would make when he assumed his enemies didn't know enough about magic to notice. Kurt teleported the advance team through the gap in 3 quick, silent hops, himself, Harry, and Logan first, materializing in a dust-choked corridor that smelled of mildew and something colder and more clinical underneath it. Some faint chemical tang that made Harry's stomach turn before he'd even seen what was causing it. 2 guards 40 feet ahead near what looks like a stairwell down. Jean's voice came through the small earpiece Hank had rigged for exactly this purpose. Her own mind extended from a safe distance outside the wards, feeding them what she could sense. I don't like what I'm reading below them. There's pain down there. A lot of it. Copy, Logan said low, already moving. Kurt, get the guards quiet. Harry, stay behind me till we clear the stairwell. Harry did not, in fact, stay entirely behind him. Some instinct pulled his attention sideways down a side corridor, even as Kurt vanished in a soft puff of brimstone to deal with the guards. And it was that instinct that saved all 3 of them a considerably worse ambush, because the side corridor held a 3rd guard Jean's reading hadn't caught, wand already half raised toward Logan's exposed back. Harry didn't think. He reached, and the electricity answered instantly, a short, precise bolt that caught the man's wand hand and sent him crumpling before he'd gotten a syllable out. Behind you, Harry said, unnecessary now, and Logan turned, saw the fallen guard, and gave Harry a short, approving nod that carried more weight than words would have. Good eyes, kid. Let's move. The stairwell down led into a basement level that had clearly, once, been the mill's boiler room, vast and echoing, and had been converted, crudely, cruelly, into something Harry would spend a long time afterward trying not to remember in too much detail. A row of iron cages lined one wall, several of them occupied, and the smell that had bothered him upstairs resolved down here into something worse. Old blood, and something acrid and magical that made his teeth ache. A lingering residue of whatever process had clearly been used over and over on the people held in this room. Bait, Harry called softly, moving down the row of cages, and a small, filthy, terrified face pressed itself to the bars of the 3rd cage, eyes going wide at the sight of him. You're not one of them, she whispered, disbelieving. You're a kid, how did you? We're getting you out, Harry said, already reaching for the lock, an ordinary iron padlock, and he felt distantly a flicker of the same golden pull that had once yanked a wand from Dolohov's hand, and the lock simply came apart in his fingers, metal twisting and giving way like it had forgotten how to be solid. Is there anyone else down here? Someone who heals fast, a boy. End cage, Bates said, scrambling out, shaking badly. They've been taking blood from him every day. For something, I don't know what, he barely wakes up anymore. The end cage held a boy who looked no older than 13, pale and gaunt in a way that made Harry's chest tighten with a fury he had to work, actively, to keep from spilling out of his hands. He was breathing, at least shallow but steady, and the moment Harry got the cage open and lifted him, gently, out onto the cold floor, he felt the boy's skin already, faintly, beginning to knit closed a shallow cut along his forearm, his gift working even in whatever drugged, half-conscious state they'd kept him in. We've got them, Harry said into the earpiece, his voice tight. 2 prisoners, both alive. One needs a medic, the second we're back at the jet. Copy that, get them to the extraction point. Xavier's voice, calm and steady even through the strain Harry could hear underneath it. Oraro and Scott are securing the far exit for you now. They were 3/4 of the way back up the stairwell, Bait clinging tightly to Harry's free hand and Logan carrying the unconscious boy without visible effort, when the mill's upper floors erupted into sudden, chaotic noise, shouting, spellfire, the unmistakable crack of multiple apparitions arriving at once. That's not our people, Logan snarled, already turning, positioning himself between the children and the stairwell above. Somebody tripped a silent alarm somewhere, and we got company incoming fast. They came around the final landing to find the corridor ahead of them blocked by three figures in dark robes, wands already raised, and at the center of them, unmistakable even in the dim light, Bellatrix Lestrange, her dark eyes lit with a manic, delighted glee at the sight of Harry Potter standing 11 feet in front of her. "Well, well," she breathed, almost singing the words. "The little baby who beat the Dark Lord, all grown up and playing hero. I heard you were something special. I heard you knocked poor Lucius clean through a gate post." Her wand twitched, playful, terrifying. "Let's see how special you really are, shall we?" "Get the kids to the exit," Harry said quietly to Logan, not taking his eyes off the woman in front of him. "I've got this." "Kid, I've got this," Harry repeated, and something in his voice, steady, absolutely certain, without a trace of bravado in it, made Logan hesitate for exactly 1 second before nodding once, sharp, and pulling bait and the unconscious boy back down the corridor, trusting him. Bellatrix's curse came fast, a lashing purple whip of dark magic that Harry recognized distantly from Diggle's carefully worded warnings about entrail-expelling curses. And he didn't try to block it. He'd learned, since the front lawn battle, exactly which spells his shield could stop, and which ones needed a body simply not to be where they were aimed. He dropped and rolled, the curse tearing a smoking gouge along the corridor wall, and came up already reaching for the golden pool, yanking her wand sideways with a violent jerk of invisible force that made her stumble half a step, cursing. "Oh, you are fun," she laughed, delighted rather than deterred, recovering her balance in an instant and sending a second curse his way even as she did. "Nobody's made me work this hard in years." Harry didn't answer her. He'd learned, over 3 months of training with people who genuinely cared whether he survived his own recklessness, that engaging a taunting enemy verbally usually just gave them more openings, and he needed every ounce of focus he had for what came next. The electricity, called up hard and fast, arcing not directly at her but at the ceiling above her head, where old, rusted pipework hung heavy and precarious, weakened by decades of neglect. The bolt struck true, and a section of pipe tore loose and crashed down between them in a shower of rust and dust, forcing Bellatrix back a full 3 steps to avoid being crushed. It bought him exactly the opening he needed. He surged forward through the settling dust, faster than she expected, and the punch he landed, square across her jaw, timed off the hips exactly the way Logan had drilled into him, staggered her badly enough that her second guard, moving to flank him, gave Harry the split-second warning he needed to spin and catch the man's incoming curse on a hastily raised shield, the blue-white energy crackling and holding just long enough to absorb the blow. Bellatrix recovered fast, wiping a thin line of blood from her split lip with something between fury and genuine, delighted admiration. "The Dark Lord's going to want you himself, little lion," she said, breathless. "I almost don't want to hand you over. Almost." She never got the chance to try harder. A crack of displaced air heralded Kurt's return, teleporting directly behind her flanking guard and dropping him with a single sharp blow before the man even registered another combatant had arrived. And in the half-second of confusion that followed, Harry surged the electricity through both hands at once, a wide arc that caught Bellatrix directly and sent her crashing backward into the stairwell wall hard enough to knock the wand from her hand and the fight from her body, though not disturbingly. The wild, delighted grin from her face even as she slid, half-conscious, down to the floor. "We need to move now," Kurt said, already pulling Harry toward the stairwell. "More coming. Jean says at least 6 more presences just arrived topside." They made the extraction point with less than 2 minutes to spare, Aurora's storm already boiling overhead to cover their retreat, and the jet lifted off from a hastily cleared stretch of the estate's old rail yard, just as the first pursuing curses lit up the darkness below them, harmlessly falling short. Harry sat in the jet's rear cabin, bait curled against his side still shaking. The unconscious boy laid carefully across 2 seats with Hank already working over him with a portable medical kit, and felt, for the first time since Danny's death, something that wasn't quite triumph but sat close enough beside it to matter: the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction of having gone looking for a wrong and actually managed to right a piece of it. "You did good tonight, kid," Logan said, settling into the seat across from him as the jet climbed. "Real good. Followed the plan, watched your team, didn't lose your head even when Bellatrix Lestrange was trying her best to bait you into it. That's not nothing for your first real op." "She said Voldemort wants me himself," Harry said quietly. "Not information about me, not leverage. He wants to see me himself." "Yeah," Logan said, and didn't try to soften it. "I figure he does." The raid made headlines in both worlds within days in wildly different forms. The Wizarding Daily Prophet ran a cautious, heavily edited account of an unauthorized raid on suspected criminal activity near Leeds, carefully avoiding any mention of Harry Potter's involvement at Dumbledore's quiet, urgent insistence, though rumors still spread through certain circles fast enough that Fudge found himself fielding increasingly pointed questions at the Ministry about exactly what, and who, had freed 2 prisoners and left Bellatrix Lestrange with a fractured jaw, and a story she apparently would not stop telling anyone who'd listen about a boy with lightning in his hands. Dumbledore arrived at the mansion 4 days later, his expression a complicated mixture of relief, concern, and something that looked, to Harry, uncomfortably close to renewed hope. "You freed 2 prisoners and confronted 3 Death Eaters, including one of Voldemort's most dangerous lieutenants, and walked away unharmed," Dumbledore said, seated across from Harry in Xavier's study, his tone carefully neutral in a way that didn't quite mask the calculation underneath it. "That is a remarkable feat for anyone, let alone an 11-year-old boy 3 months into serious training. Is there a question in there, sir, or just an observation?" Dumbledore's mouth quirked faintly. "Both, I suppose. I wonder, Harry, whether recent events have changed your thinking at all about Hogwarts, about the prophecy. I don't ask to pressure you. You're asking because Voldemort just found out I'm not a helpless child hiding behind Muggle protections, and you're wondering if that changes my usefulness to your side of this war," Harry said, flat, not unkind but entirely unwilling to let the question hide behind gentler phrasing. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. "That is," he admitted finally, "not an unfair characterization. I find myself more and more unable to fault your clarity, Harry, even when it costs me some comfort to hear it plainly." He folded his hands. "I will tell you honestly, I believe the war is coming faster now, not slower, because of what happened at Leeds. Voldemort has learned you are not merely alive but formidable, and men like him do not respond to formidable threats by waiting patiently. I worry deeply that the choice you've made to remain outside the wizarding world structures may leave you facing him without allies who understand exactly what he is and how he fights." "I have allies," Harry said. "They're just not the ones you'd have picked for me." "No," Dumbledore agreed, quiet, "they are not. And I will confess, Harry, that troubles me, not because I doubt their loyalty to you, which I have seen demonstrated rather dramatically these past months, but because they cannot teach you the specific magical history, the specific vulnerabilities, the specific tactics that a war against Voldemort will require. I would like to offer you something more if you'll permit it. Not Hogwarts. Not yet, not against your wishes. But direct instruction from myself, when I can manage it, and access to certain protected knowledge about Voldemort's past that might prove useful, should the day come you choose to face him." Harry considered that for a long moment, weighing it the way he'd learned to weigh every offer, and found this time that he genuinely didn't sense a trap in it, only a tired, grieving old man trying imperfectly to make himself useful to a boy he'd failed once already. "I'd take that," Harry said finally. "On one condition. You don't get to decide ever again what I'm told and what I'm not because you've judged it kinder to keep something from me. Everything, however bad it is." "Everything," Dumbledore agreed, and something in his weathered face eased slightly, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying too long. "You have my word, Harry. I have learned this year precisely what it costs to withhold truth from you in the name of protecting you from it." Eric Laneshare's second visit came 3 weeks later, and this time he didn't bother with the pretense of sneaking through a window. He simply appeared at the edge of the mansion's grounds in broad daylight, standing at the gate with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man who knew precisely how unwelcome and how untouchable he currently was, and waited for someone to come out and meet him. Harry went alone, against Logan's muttered objections, because some part of him wanted this conversation without an audience this time. "You've been busy," Eric said by way of greeting, his gray eyes tracking Harry's approach with open, assessing interest. "Leeds. Bellatrix Lestrange with a fractured jaw. I confess I found the reports rather satisfying reading." "I didn't do it for your satisfaction." "No," Eric agreed easily. "You did it because a child died in front of you, and you decided correctly that waiting patiently for the next attack was a luxury you could no longer afford." "That is precisely the kind of clarity I hoped you'd arrive at eventually, Mr. Potter, though I confess I did not expect it quite so quickly." He studied Harry for a moment. "I imagine Dumbledore has come calling again, offering his own version of guidance. And Charles, no doubt, has offered his careful, measured support, wrapped in enough caveats to make certain you never move faster than his comfort allows." "You're not wrong about either of them," Harry said. "You're wrong about what it means, though. Dumbledore's trying to make up for a mistake he finally admitted to making. Xavier's not slowing me down, he's making sure I don't get myself killed doing something reckless. Neither of them's trying to own me, they're trying to help me. Perhaps," Eric allowed, unbothered by the pushback, "or perhaps both of them have simply learned, watching you these past months, that trying to control you outright would fail spectacularly, and so they've adjusted their methods to something softer, more palatable guidance instead of command. The effect in the end may prove remarkably similar." He tilted his head slightly. "I don't say this to poison you against them, Mr. Potter. I say it because I think you're clever enough to hear it and still make up your own mind, which is rather the entire point of everything I've ever offered you." "What exactly have you offered me?" Harry asked. "Because you've shown up twice now, said a lot of true-sounding things, and never actually asked me for anything. That's not really an offer, that's a pitch." Something flickered across Eric's face, not offense, but something closer to genuine, surprised approval. "Fair," he admitted. "Very well, here is the offer plainly. When this war with your Dark Lord reaches its worst point, and it will, Mr. Potter, wars like this always do, you may find that neither Charles's patient diplomacy nor Dumbledore's careful old-world caution gives you what you actually need in the moment it matters most. When that day comes, there will be people under my banner willing to act without hesitation, without waiting for permission from committees or ministries or prophecies to make certain the people you love survive it. That is the offer, not loyalty to me, not abandonment of your friends here, simply a door left open for the moment you need force applied without apology." Harry was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. "And in exchange," Eric said, "I ask nothing now. Perhaps someday I will ask you to stand beside me when humanity once again proves it fears us more than it will ever love us. You may say Number, I rather suspect, given what I've seen of you, that you often will say no to a great many people about a great many things. I find that I respect you considerably more for it than I would if you simply agreed with everything I said." He turned to go and paused, glancing back with something almost like genuine warmth in his gray eyes. "For what it's worth, Mr. Potter, I am sorry about the boy, Danny. I did not know him, but I understand grief of that particular shape rather better than most. It does not get smaller. It simply teaches you what you're willing to become to make sure it never happens again." He inclined his head slightly. "Good day." He was gone before Harry could decide how to answer, and Harry stood alone at the gate for a long time afterward, watching the empty road, turning over the strange, uncomfortable truth that Eric Laneshare, dangerous, unapologetic, ideologically opposed to nearly everything Xavier stood for, had, in 2 brief conversations, understood something about Harry's grief that neither Dumbledore nor Xavier, for all their careful kindness, had quite managed to name aloud. He didn't tell Xavier every detail of that conversation, but he told him enough, and Xavier listened without judgment, and at the end of it simply asked, gently, "And what do you think, Harry, about the door he's offering to leave open?" "I think," Harry said slowly, "that I don't need his door. I've got my own. I'm not choosing between you and him and Dumbledore, Professor. I'm choosing my own way of doing this, and all 3 of you are going to have to get used to the fact that I'm not going to hand that choice over to any of you, no matter how good your reasons are." Xavier smiled, small and genuinely proud. "Good," he said simply. "That's exactly the answer I hoped you'd give." It was 2 weeks after that conversation, on a cold, clear December evening with the first snow of the season just beginning to dust the mansion's grounds, that Jean Grey came running to find Harry in the training hall, her face pale with an urgency that made his stomach drop before she'd said a single word. "Cerebro just caught something," she said, breathless. "Charles wants you in the chamber right now. Harry, there's a mutant signature registering near Little Hangleton, small village in England. And it's tangled up with something else. Something Charles says feels almost exactly like the scar reading he caught off you, the very first night we found you." Harry felt the cold, clear certainty settle over him instantly, the same feeling that had carried him through the Leeds raid without hesitation. "Voldemort," he said. "Charles thinks so." Jean confirmed. "He thinks Voldemort's finally found a way to regain a body, and he thinks, whatever that mutant signature is that's tangled up with him, it might be exactly the kind of power he needs to finish the job." Harry was already moving toward the door before she'd finished speaking, the training hall's lights flickering faintly with the electricity gathering, unbidden but no longer frightening, beneath his skin. "Then we're not waiting for him to come find us again," Harry said. "This time, we go to him first." Chapter 6. Weird the graveyard at Little Hangleton sat on a low hill above the village, ringed by ancient yew trees, and even from the air, even through the blackbird's reinforced viewport, Harry could feel something wrong radiating off the place, a cold, greasy pressure at the edge of his awareness that made the scar on his forehead prickle for the first time in months. "That's him," Harry said quietly, watching the dark shape of a crumbling manor house on the hill beyond the graveyard grow larger through the window. "I can feel him, like a smell you can't quite place, except it's in my head instead of my nose." "The connection Dumbledore described," Xavier said, from the seat beside him, his own expression tight with concentration. "I can feel it too, now that I know to look for it. There's a thread between your mind and something down there, old and thin and very carefully hidden. I believe, Harry, that whatever ritual he's attempting tonight, it's drawing directly on that connection somehow. We need to move quickly." Dumbledore, seated across the aisle in robes that looked entirely out of place against the blackbird's sleek gray interior, nodded grimly. "The signature Cerebro detected, the mutant tangled up in his presence. I have a theory, and I don't like it." He glanced at Harry. "There is an old, dark ritual, one I hoped never to see performed in my lifetime, that requires the caster to draw upon a body's regenerative capacity to rebuild flesh that has been destroyed. If Voldemort has found a mutant whose gift mirrors rapid healing, he's using them as spare parts, Harry said flatly, the cold fury from Leeds rising up in him again, familiar now, almost comfortable in how clearly it focused his thinking. Same as the mill. He hates what we are, and he'll happily carve us up to get what he wants anyway. That would be consistent with everything I know of the man, Dumbledore said quietly, which is precisely why we cannot wait for a more convenient moment to move. Logan, standing near the cockpit door with his arms crossed, cracked his knuckles once, a sound like small bones breaking. Then let's stop talking about it. They came down in a stand of trees a quarter-mile from the graveyard, Kurt scouting ahead in 3 quick, silent teleports and reporting back within minutes. A dozen Death Eaters at least, robed and masked, gathered in a loose circle around a large stone cauldron set among the headstones, its contents already bubbling with a sickly green light visible even from the tree line. Chained to a headstone near the cauldron's edge, half-conscious and clearly exhausted, was a boy who couldn't have been older than 16, his skin marked with dozens of small, precise incisions that were, even as Harry watched through Kurt's borrowed description, healing over almost as quickly as they'd been made, and being reopened again over and over by a hunched, rat-faced man Harry recognized instantly from Diggle's careful briefings. Wormtail, Harry said low. Pettigrew. Betrayed your parents to Voldemort personally, Dumbledore confirmed, his voice gone very hard. I would take considerable satisfaction in seeing him answer for that tonight, after we get that boy out of there alive, Harry said, and there was no room for negotiation in his voice at all. They moved into position with the same careful, drilled precision Harry had learned over 6 months of training that had never once, until tonight, felt quite this urgent. Oraro took to the sky above the tree line, clouds already gathering thick and dark to mask their approach and drown out the sound of their movement. Scott and Jean flanked left along the low stone wall bordering the graveyard's edge, Kurt ready to teleport wherever the fighting demanded him most. Logan and Dumbledore took the right flank, an odd pairing that had, over the past weeks of joint planning sessions, settled into something approaching genuine mutual respect. Xavier remained at the tree line, his mind extended wide across the whole graveyard, ready to warn of any threat before it fully materialized. And Harry walked straight up the middle, alone, in full view, because he had decided, 3 days ago in the planning room, that this was exactly how it needed to happen. He's not going to send his people after a hostage first if he sees me walking in unafraid, Harry had argued when Xavier had objected. He's going to want to see me himself. That buys the rest of you the time you need to get into position around the edges without anyone noticing. He'd been right. The moment he stepped out of the tree line and into the pale, sickly light of the cauldron's glow, a ripple of alarm went through the assembled Death Eaters, wands snapping up in a dozen directions at once, and then a voice, high and cold and utterly without warmth, rose from somewhere near the cauldron's edge, and every wand in the circle lowered, obedient, waiting. Well, the voice said, and Harry watched with a strange, distant calm as a shape rose slowly from behind the cauldron's rim, not fully human yet, something raw and half-formed, skin stretched too tight over something that hadn't finished deciding what it wanted to be, red eyes already burning with an intelligence and a malice that needed no finished body to be devastating. Harry Potter, walking into my graveyard on his own 2 feet, without so much as a wand raised in his defense. Either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. I confess I've heard conflicting reports on which. You wanted to see me, Harry said, his voice carrying clean and steady across the still night air. Here I am, Let's talk before you finish whatever you're doing to that boy chained to the headstone. Voldemort's raw, half-formed face twisted into something that might on a fuller face have been amusement. You care about him, a stranger, a mutant no less, one of the very freaks my followers and I have spent this last year hunting for sport and study alike. A dry, rasping laugh. How very like your mother. She always did have that particular weakness, caring for creatures beneath her notice. He's not beneath anyone's notice, Harry said. And you don't get to talk about my mother like you understood a single thing about her. I understood enough to kill her, Voldemort said simply, coldly, and something in Harry's chest went white-hot and utterly, dangerously calm all at once. Tell me, boy, do you feel it? The little thread between us. I've felt it grow these past months, watching you from a very great distance, watching you grow into something considerably more interesting than the sniveling infant I once tried to kill. I wonder what it would feel like to finally pull that thread taut and see exactly what's on the other end of it. He raised one raw, half-formed hand, and Harry felt the pull instantly. A cold, invasive pressure against the inside of his skull. Exactly like the scar's old aches except vastly, violently magnified. Voldemort's will trying to force its way directly into his mind through the thin, ancient connection between them. Harry had spent 5 months learning, patiently, painstakingly, from Jean and from Xavier both, exactly how to build walls inside his own mind that no one, not even a telepath as powerful as either of them, could breach without his permission. He had never once had to use that training against something trying to actively force its way in with malicious intent. He used it now. The pressure met a wall that had not existed the last time Voldemort had tried to touch that connection, years and years ago, when Harry had been a helpless infant with no defenses at all. And instead of the pliable, unguarded mind Voldemort had clearly expected to find, he found something hard, and cold, and absolutely, immovably closed. Voldemort's half-formed face contorted, genuine surprise breaking through the malice for just a moment. "That's not possible," he hissed. "No wizard your age has that kind of occlumency." "I'm not just a wizard," Harry said, and the electricity came up through him in a single vast surge, no hesitation in it at all, arcing outward from his hands with enough force to send the nearest 3 Death Eaters diving for cover. "You never bothered to find that out before you decided you wanted me dragged in here tonight, did you? You just assumed I'd be exactly what the prophecy said I'd be. You assumed wrong." The graveyard erupted into chaos in the same instant, right on cue, Aurora's storm breaking open overhead in a sudden, violent downpour that made Spellfear sizzle and hiss against wet stone. Scott's optic blasts tearing gaps in the Death Eater's loose circle. Kurt teleporting in short, brutal bursts to disarm and disorient before vanishing again. Logan and Dumbledore driving hard from the right flank with a coordinated, devastating precision that scattered the outer edge of Voldemort's gathered followers within the first 30 seconds. Wormtail, near the cauldron, made the fatal mistake of raising his wand toward the chained boy instead of fleeing. Some panicked, cruel instinct toward destroying the ritual's key component rather than let it be rescued. And Harry's electricity caught him before the curse had even fully formed, sending the man sprawling, unconscious, wand skittering away across wet grass. "Somebody get that boy loose," Harry shouted, and Jean was already there, telekinesis snapping the chains apart with a sharp crack of metal, hauling the exhausted, bleeding teenager away from the cauldron's edge and into the relative safety of the tree line where Hank waited, medical kit already open. Voldemort watched his ritual's careful preparations collapse into ruin around him with an expression of pure, incandescent fury, his half-formed body trembling with the effort of maintaining even its current shape without the boy's stolen regeneration to finish the process. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled, advancing on Harry directly now, ignoring the chaos of the battle spreading out behind him. I have waited 14 years for a body, boy. I will not be denied it by a child playing soldier with a room full of freaks and one tired old man. You keep calling us freaks, Harry said, standing his ground as Voldemort closed the distance, like it's supposed to hurt. I spent 10 years being called that by people who beat me for it. You know what I learned? It's not an insult if you stop believing the people who use it. It's just a word. And it's not even accurate because there's nothing wrong with what any of us are. He raised his hands, electricity crawling bright and steady up both arms now, and behind it, threading through, the golden pull beginning to gather as well, heavier and stranger, bending the wet grass and loose gravestones around them both inward very slightly, toward some invisible center. You're the one who needed to carve a healing mutant open on an altar just to survive the night. That's not power, Voldemort. That's desperation wearing a scary mask. Something in Voldemort's raw, unfinished face cracked with genuine rage at that, and the curse he sent screaming toward Harry was faster and more vicious than anything Bellatrix had managed at the mill, a torrent of dark, twisting magic that Harry felt, even before it landed, was meant to kill outright. He didn't dodge this one. He'd learned enough over the months to recognize when dodging wasn't the smarter play, and instead he did something he'd only managed once before in a danger room simulation, and never once outside it. He pulled the shield up not as a static wall, but as a spinning, layered barrier, electricity and something older woven together, and the curse struck it and simply dissolved, unraveled at the edges like thread pulled from a hem, the dark magic finding nothing solid enough in the barrier's structure to latch onto and take hold. Voldemort stared at the unraveled remains of his own curse, disbelieving, and in that half-second of stunned hesitation, Harry moved. He didn't reach for lightning this time. He reached for the golden pull instead, directing it with a precision he hadn't fully trusted himself to manage until this exact moment, and yanked, not at Voldemort's wand hand, not at any single object, but at the ground itself beneath the half-formed body's feet, a sudden violent collapse of gravity that dropped Voldemort hard onto his knees among the wet grass and scattered gravestones. "This ends tonight," Harry said, closing the distance fast, electricity gathering white-hot in both fists. "Not because some prophecy says it has to, because you keep hurting people I care about, and I've decided I'm done letting that happen while I wait for permission from anybody." Voldemort's red eyes, wild now, tracked past Harry's shoulder to where the battle had turned decisively against his scattered followers. 3 already down, 2 more fleeing into the tree line only to find Eric Laneshare standing there. Arrived without invitation exactly as he'd promised months ago. His hand raised and every scrap of metal on their persons, wands, buckles, rings, tearing free and pinning them effortlessly to the nearest headstones. "I did say I'd leave a door open," Eric called across the graveyard, entirely unbothered by the chaos, his voice carrying an easy, dangerous amusement. "Didn't expect to use it quite this soon, Mr. Potter, but I confess the timing suits me rather well." "Didn't ask for your help," Harry called back, not taking his eyes off Voldemort. "No," Eric agreed. "I offered it anyway. That's rather the point of an open door." Voldemort, kneeling in the wet grass with his half-formed body trembling, made one last, desperate lunge, not toward Harry, but toward the still-bubbling cauldron, some final, instinctive grab for whatever remained of the interrupted ritual's power, and Dumbledore's voice cut across the graveyard, sharp and absolutely final, a spell Harry had never heard him use before, tearing through the air and striking the cauldron dead center, shattering the ancient stone into 1,000 pieces, and scattering the sickly green contents harmlessly across the wet ground. "No," Dumbledore said, arriving at Harry's side, his wand still raised, his ancient face set in an expression of grim, unyielding purpose. "I think not, Tom. Not tonight." Voldemort turned, half-formed and furious and increasingly desperate between the old wizard on one side and the boy he'd once tried to kill as an infant on the other, and something in his raw, unfinished face finally, fully cracked into naked fear. "You cannot kill what does not fully live," he hissed, backing away. "I will simply find another way, another ritual, another." "Maybe," Harry said, and the electricity in his hands surged one final time, vast and absolute, no hesitation left in it at all. "But not with that boy's stolen healing. Not tonight, and not with any of the people I care about ever again." The bolt that left his hands was unlike anything he'd called up before. Electricity and golden light woven together into something that had no proper name. Something Hank would spend weeks afterward trying and failing to fully categorize. And it struck Voldemort's unfinished, unstable body directly. And where lesser curses had merely torn flesh he did not yet fully possess, this unraveled him entirely. The raw, half-formed shape dissolving into scattered light and ash and a thin, keening scream that cut off abruptly into silence. The graveyard went very, very quiet. Rain continued to fall, softening now as Aurora's storm began slowly to settle. Around the shattered cauldron, the remaining Death Eaters, those still conscious, those Eric hadn't already pinned helplessly to headstones, stood frozen, staring at the empty space where their master had, a moment ago, stood. "Is he?" Scott started, lowering his visor slightly, disbelieving. "Gone," Dumbledore said quietly, lowering his own wand at last, his weathered face carrying an expression of profound, exhausted relief. "Truly gone this time, I believe. Whatever thread bound that fragment of him to this world, I do not believe it survived what Harry just did to it." He turned to look at Harry, and something in his ancient blue eyes was, for the first time since they'd met, entirely without calculation, entirely without agenda, just quiet, genuine wonder. "In all my years, Harry, I have never seen anything quite like that." "Neither have I," Harry admitted, breathing hard, the electricity finally, slowly settling back beneath his skin. "Didn't really plan it. Just knew somehow what it needed to be. The cleanup took the better part of an hour, Ministry Aurors arriving late, summoned by wards that had finally registered the magical disturbance from 3 counties away, led by a stern, capable-looking witch named Amelia Bones, who took one look at the graveyard's scattered wreckage, the pinned and unconscious Death Eaters, the shattered cauldron, and the boy standing calmly in the center of it, all with electricity still faintly crawling along his forearms, and let out a long, slow breath that carried more relief than shock. "You're Potter," she said, not quite a question. "I am. Cornelius has spent the better part of a year insisting you were either dead, kidnapped, or being groomed into some kind of weapon by dangerous Muggle interests," Bones said, glancing around the graveyard once more, taking careful stock of Eric still standing calmly by the tree line, of Xavier's team gathering the freed boy gently between them, of Dumbledore standing at Harry's side, without a trace of the Ministry's paranoid suspicion in his posture at all. "I don't suppose you'd care to tell me which of those it actually was." "None of them," Harry said. "I was exactly where I chose to be, learning exactly what I chose to learn, and tonight I ended the person who murdered my parents and has been hunting Muggle-borns and mutants alike for over a year. If your minister has a problem with how that happened, he's welcome to say so to my face." Bones studied him for a long moment, and something in her stern expression eased very slightly into something that looked almost like respect. "I don't think he will," she said finally. "I think, Mr. Potter, that after tonight, Cornelius Fudge is going to be considerably more interested in taking credit for your continued safety than in questioning where you've chosen to spend it." She wasn't wrong. Within the week, the Daily Prophet ran a front-page story hailing the brave rescue operation, coordinated between British magical authorities and international allies. that had brought about the second and final defeat of He Who Must Not Be Named, a careful, diplomatic fiction that Fudge's office had crafted almost overnight, one that mentioned Harry Potter's name prominently and mentioned Charles Xavier's mansion not at all, a compromise Xavier accepted without complaint because, as he told Harry over breakfast a few days later, some battles are worth fighting for principle, Harry, and some are worth simply letting go, so long as the people who matter know the truth of what actually happened. The boy from the graveyard, his name, they learned once he was well enough to speak clearly, was Owen Marsh, 17 years old, taken from a group home in Manchester 8 months earlier and never once reported missing by anyone who'd cared enough to look, recovered slowly over the following weeks in the mansion's infirmary, his healing gift, mercifully, working overtime on the damage that had been done to his own body. Harry visited him most days, at first out of a quiet, guilty need to make certain this rescue, unlike Danny's, had actually stuck, and later simply because Owen turned out to have a dry, understated sense of humor that Harry genuinely liked. "You know," Owen said, one gray afternoon in early January, sitting up properly in the infirmary bed for the first time, "when they told me a kid was the one who blew up the whole operation, I pictured someone a bit taller." "Everybody pictures someone taller," Harry said, and Owen laughed. A real laugh, rough from disuse but genuine, and something in Harry's chest, still carrying the old, careful weight of Danny's death, eased by another small degree. Eric Laneshire did not come to collect on any debt after the graveyard, exactly as Harry had suspected he wouldn't. He sent instead a single short note a few weeks later, delivered by unclear means directly to Harry's desk, which read simply, "You didn't need the door. I'm glad. That was rather the point of leaving it open." Harry showed it to Xavier, who read it twice and set it down with an expression that mingled wariness with something almost fond. "He respects you a great deal, Harry. That worries me more than his hostility ever would." Eric's admiration has a way of becoming its own kind of pressure over time. "I know," Harry said. "I'm not going anywhere, Professor, but I'm not going to pretend he was wrong about everything either. Sometimes help arrives without being asked, and it's still worth something." "That," Xavier said after a moment, "is a more nuanced answer than I gave that particular question at your age. I think you'll be all right, Harry. I think you'll be more than all right." Dumbledore's visit, the last of that long, eventful winter, came on a bright, cold morning at the end of January, and this time he did not arrive with letters or prophecies or careful diplomatic openings. He arrived simply to talk, seated across from Harry in the mansion's library with 2 cups of tea going cold between them, untouched. "I owe you an apology," Dumbledore said, without preamble, "that I have been circling for some months now without quite finding the courage to state plainly. I placed a great deal of weight on your shoulders before you were old enough to consent to carrying any of it. The prophecy, the wards, the whole careful architecture of a life I designed for you without once asking what you actually wanted from it. You have spent this past year proving, again and again, that you were never obligated to accept a single piece of that architecture, and that the parts of it worth keeping were only ever worth keeping because you chose them freely on your own terms." He paused. "I am sorry, Harry, genuinely, for the cupboard, however unwittingly I contributed to it, for the prophecy, however little control either of us had over its existence, and for every moment I mistook necessary for kind, when they were very rarely in your case the same thing at all." Harry sat with that for a long moment, the winter light falling pale and clean through the library windows, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he believed every word of it. "I forgive you," Harry said finally. "Not because you've earned some kind of clean slate, sir. I don't think anybody gets one of those, not really. But because holding on to it doesn't make me stronger. It just makes the weight heavier for no reason. He considered his next words carefully. I'd still like you to keep teaching me, not because the prophecy said I had to learn it, because it's part of who I am and I choose to learn it properly from someone who actually knows what he's talking about. Dumbledore's ancient eyes, for just a moment, shone with something suspiciously close to tears. I would be honored, Harry, truly. They held a small gathering in the mansion's great hall on the first weekend of February. Nothing grand. Kitty had insisted on decorations. Kurt had insisted on food considerably spicier than the kitchen staff's usual fare. And Logan had grumbled about the whole affair right up until the moment it actually started, at which point he'd settled into a corner with a plate stacked improbably high, and refused to admit he was enjoying himself at all. It wasn't a celebration of Voldemort's defeat, exactly, though that shadow hung quietly, gratefully beneath everything. It was, Xavier had said simply when he proposed it, a celebration of 6 months and everything you've built in them. And Harry, standing near the great hall's tall windows with Owen laughing at something Kitty had just said, with Bate Turner, fully recovered now and staying on at the mansion at her own insistent request, trading stories with a small cluster of younger students, with Jean and Scott dancing badly and without shame in the middle of the room, understood, watching it all. Exactly what Xavier meant. Logan found him there a little while later, 2 mugs of hot cocoa in hand, offering one over without a word. You did good, kid, Logan said, settling in beside him at the window, watching the party continue behind them. Real good, better than good, honestly. Most people twice your age couldn't have handled half of what you handled this year and come out the other side still able to laugh at something stupid Kurt says at dinner. I had help, Harry said. Lots of it. I don't think I'd have made it through any of this alone. Nah, Logan agreed easily. Nobody makes it through anything worth doing alone. That's not weakness, kid. That's just Bane, smart enough to know what family's actually for. Harry thought about that for a long moment, watching the snow drift softly past the tall windows outside. Thought about a cupboard under a staircase 3,000 miles and a lifetime away. About a night of storm and static that had cracked open a door he hadn't even known existed. About a boy made of light who taught him, without ever meaning to, exactly what it looked like to be brave on purpose. I chose a name for myself, Harry said finally, quiet. For missions. Hank's been bugging me about it for weeks, says I need something for the official reports besides just Harry. Yeah, what you land on? Weird, Harry said. Old word. Means fate, sort of, except the older meaning's closer to the thing that becomes, through your own choices. Not something written down for you ahead of time, something you make as you go. He glanced sideways at Logan, half embarrassed, half certain. Felt right, considering. Logan studied him for a long moment, something rough and unmistakably proud settling into his weathered face, and raised his mug in a small, solemn toast. Weird, he said, testing the word, nodding slowly. Yeah. That fits you exactly right, kid. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and steady over the mansion's grounds, over a quiet corner of the estate where a small headstone read simply Daniel Chen. He made light, over a lake gone still and silver under the winter sky, over a boy who had once slept in a cupboard under the stairs and now stood, warm and unafraid, surrounded by the family he had chosen for himself, exactly on his own terms, precisely as he'd always deserved to. He was not the boy who lived anymore, not really, not in any way that mattered to him. He was not the chosen one, not a symbol, not a weapon for anyone's war but his own. He was simply, finally, entirely himself, and for the first time in his life, that had always been more than enough.